Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 941. The moment he saw the middle-aged man dressed in a priest's get-up, Anderson zoned out for a second. Following that, some shackles in his mind suddenly collapsed as countless memory fragments surged through an invisible barrier. It felt like long-suppressed feelings suddenly erupted. He remembered the things that had happened over the past 2 months. He remembered the mission that the demigod had given him. Back in Bayam, he followed the thoughts in his mind to meet up with the demigod. He followed him and left the Rorsted archipelago for a secret location. There, he met the priest beside him. It was arranged for him to enter an ancient coffin, to lay there among beyonder ingredients and a liquid filled with strange mixed blood, allowing them to seep into him. After a month of this corrosive treatment, a dark red chrysalis formed inside his body. He then had his memories from this period of time sealed before being sent to West Balam. He was then psychologically cued to not leave until he recovered his memories. This meant that he hadn't finished the demigod's mission and that it was still underway. Everything that had happened before were just preparations. Scenes flashed through his mind as Anderson discovered that while he was playing the harmonica on the streets, checking into the hotel with Danitz, obtaining of language comprehension charms from the Church of Knowledge preachers, as well as his arrival in Northern State, all of these incidents had this genial and seemingly innocent priest present beside him the entire time. When having meals, he was sitting at a neighboring table. When he checked in, the neighboring room was his. When walking on the streets, he was walking right beside him. When playing the harmonica and putting on the ventriloquist act, this man was looking at him in a genial manner. And Anderson hadn't noticed any of this back then. Danitz, who was beside him, the people around him. None of them had noticed him. It was as though they had never seen this priest before. A chill that arose from deep in his heart ran from his tailbone up his spine to his brain. He felt that the experiences he had been through were enough to drive him insane, to the point of losing control. This novelbin.com for new updates. Danitz, who had already opened up a distance from Anderson, looked at the black-robed clergyman, in Zangwill, and then he looked at the simple priest who was praying with his eyes closed. He hurriedly bowed his head and used ancient Hermes to softly chant, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era." The mysterious ruler above the grey fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck. A few days earlier, he had received Mr. Fool's revelation to handle some matters as a guise to stay around Anderson. It was so that he could immediately pray if any abnormalities were to happen. Although he didn't know what would happen or who he had encountered, Danitz, who always cherished his life, didn't hold back and did as he was told even if the abnormalities that happened might very well be him being overly imaginative. For this, he had specially worn the boxing glove made from Grozel's Beyonder characteristic. It ensured that he would act first without thinking so as to not waste any time. At this point, Zangwill had stopped walking. His dark blue, nearly black eye and the eye filled with blood vessels reflected the priest in simple white robes who had a cross hanging by his chest. In his mind, in his mouth, a furious voice sounded. Adam. The Creator's son, King of Angels, Adam. Before Zangwill could finish his sentence, the priest opposite him opened his eyes. His light-colored eyes were already pure gold in color. Suddenly, pitch-black stone columns were erected around them, setting up a majestic cathedral. Inside this cathedral, each column, each arch, and each dome's surface was embedded with the bones of different races. They were densely packed as they used different eye sockets to stare at Zangwill. They surrounded a cross that was more than 100 meters tall. In front of the cross, a blurry figure stood there as though he was watching everything with compassion. This was a cathedral of corpses, but instead of appearing eerie, it was filled with holiness. The walls, windows, and doors of the cathedral had transparent, warped faces protruding out. It was as though countless souls were sealed inside, preventing Beyonders from sensing the existence of the spirit world or astral world. The square and pedestrians from before had vanished. They were kept outside the corpse cathedral that had suddenly appeared. Zangwill's classic quill had already flown up as it wrote rapidly on his black clergyman's robe. Anderson heard is German Sparrow's friend. Ouroboros had taken notice of him, and due to various unknown reasons, Ouroboros's appearance here was a development that adhered to logic. Just as the quill wrote the exclamation mark, light beams shone in from the colored windows of the corpse cathedral, forming stacked illusory pure feathers. Beneath the enveloping feathers, a figure with long silver hair materialized in a genuflecting, praying stance. Following that, the figure stood up straight. He wore a simple linen robe and had handsome looks and soft facial features. He was none other than King of Angels, Tail Devourer Ouroboros. Ouroboros's eyes were momentarily unfocused, but it soon reflected the genial priest's image. In his eyes, at his feet, and on the stacked feathers of light behind him, a supernatural, mysterious circle was accentuated, forming an illusory river like a snake that had its head connected to its tail. The corpse cathedral once again reverted to the point when the pitch-black stone columns erected with the surrounding square were still on the border of existence. Taking this opportunity, Ouroboros flew out. Insangwil didn't hesitate as he made the surrounding colors saturate and overlap against each other. Just as this night watcher was about to step into the spirit world, he suddenly saw a cross spanning more than 100 meters in size plummet down from high above. This cross impaled the middle of the unformed corpse cathedral as the blurry figure that carried the cross raised its head. Infinite light spewed out, drowning Ouroboros and the quill holding Insangwil within. The corpse cathedral filled with bones of different races, and the countless warped souls took form once again. Upon hearing the stacked, illusory pleas, Klein was inside his hotel and thinking about his daily miscellaneous matters and lampooning in boredom. He suddenly stood up, went straight to the window, and looked towards the nearby square. On the square, coffins were coming and going. The fountain was still spewing, and there was reverberating music. Everything seemed normal and even felt idyllic. Here, what seemed most unharmonious was Anderson genuflecting with a stiff expression while a trembling Danitz was closing his eyes praying. Without a second thought, Klein followed the plan he had formulated above the grey fog. He controlled Winner Enzo, who was 100 meters away, to enter the telegraph office. He had instructed Danitz to live beside a telegraph office. At the same time, he took out his adventurer's harmonica and blew into it. Rionette Tinker walked out of the void with the 4 blonde, red-eyed heads in hand. All 8 eyes turned to the square. For Leonard, Miss Messenger. He likely hasn't left your detection range. Klein took out a letter he had already prepared and a gold coin before handing it to Miss Messenger. What he said and did was akin to a marionette. He only followed the instructions he had prepared in advance. If he couldn't help think of something else, he would immediately use cogitation to divert his attention. This was the method he figured out from Wool or Septin on how to deal with 0-08. By doing the thinking above the grey fog, all he did was act according to plan in the real world. And in a particular prayer from Danitz, Klein had used the scene that appeared to observe Anderson, who was nearby. In the end, he discovered an unfamiliar priest who also felt familiar by his side. Thinking back to the psychology alchemists and the Twilight Hermit Order's hidden connection, and making the connection to the content in Emperor Rozel's diary, Klein immediately realized something. He was certain about what would happen next. The master of the Twilight Hermit Order, the son of the creator, angel of imagination Adam, was conspiring to obtain 0-08. This also meant that there was a high chance for Insangwil to appear with Anderson as the target. Then, Klein redid his plan above the grey fog, pretending as though he had never noticed anything. He continued his state as a marionette in reality. One of Rionette Tinker's heads bit onto the letter as the 8 eyes looked deeply at Klein for 2 seconds. Klein nodded indiscernibly without a word, watching Miss Messenger return to the spirit world. In the Kukawa telegraph office, Winner Enzo handed over the telegram, address, and Volgold he had already prepared for the staff, urging them to send it immediately. West Balam, Northern State, Kukawa. Insangwil has appeared. The radio waves quickly spread, sending the message to the major bases of the Church of Evernight in West Balam and East Balam. East Balam. Why are you always active around the cathedral? Why don't you go further to carry out the investigations? Daly asked Leonard. Leonard thought and said frankly and seriously, awaiting news. Daly nodded in thought without prying further. She turned silent, no longer playing jokes on Leonard. It was as though she was waiting for something as well. Suddenly, Leonard's spiritual perception was triggered as he turned to look left. As a gatekeeper, Daly had already cast her eyes in that direction. A letter had appeared at some point in time, landing underneath a gas street lamp. Leonard didn't avoid Daly as he hurriedly picked up the envelope and opened it. The content of the letter was very simple. There was only one line. West Balam, Northern State, Kakawa, Revival Square. Coordinates. Leonard's expression turned heavy as he turned to Daly and said, "Please help me to cover my tracks." As he spoke, his left glove had turned transparent. He stuffed his right hand into his pocket and grasped the fate siphon charm. Daly fell silent for a second and said extremely seriously, "Bring me along. Back then, you managed to at least fight, but I didn't have the time to do anything." Leonard's expression changed as his mouth gaped slightly. Finally, without saying a word, he grabbed Daly's shoulder. The two then vanished from the rather empty streets. As he watched Miss Messenger leave, and once he confirmed that the telegraph office had at least sent one telegram, Klein immediately took 4 steps counterclockwise and entered above the grey fog. He directly sat at the high-backed chair of the fool and beckoned for the tire and card, the sea god scepter, and a silver-grey charm. Immediately, he was wearing a papal tiara with a papal robe draped over him with a bone scepter in hand. Amid silver bolts of lightning, Klein spread his spirituality towards the point of light where Danitz was. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 942. With Klein's spirituality making contact, the point of light suddenly expanded into a scene before his eyes. With his shadow cloak up, Danitz was praying with his head bowed in the corner of the square, chanting the fool's honorific name with ancient Hermes. Thanks to this, Klein could see an expanded area around him, and he began searching for Zangwell. Through the grey fog, everything he saw was clearly different from what he had previously seen. In the middle of the square, a pitch-black corpse-embedded cathedral had appeared at some point in time. It was dark inside, but there wasn't any signs of activity inside. Using this opportunity, Klein replied Danitz's prayer, "Leave the area. Find a hidden spot to hide in." As he spoke slowly, dressed in the papal tiara and dark robes, Klein raised his left hand and made the blue gems at the tip of the bone scepter light up. Sharp, jarring sounds immediately resounded in Revival Square in the real world as a sudden gale swept the area. It made the people who were spending their leisure time there or the pedestrians to leave quickly to head for shelter from the wind. Even Anderson, who had a frozen expression, recovered his usual insouciant attitude. Holding his abdomen, he quickly rushed out of the dangerous area. In a few seconds, Revival Square became extremely silent. Even the pedestrians who walked slowly without running had experienced the feeling of flying with the nudging of the wind. The empty area entered a brief silence. Then, a flame appeared from the corpse cathedral's window. It grew in size and became increasingly blinding. Silently, the colored glass windows shattered as blinding white light that bordered on blue shot out like a meteor. This flaming light instantly crumbled, materializing into Zangwell, who wore a black clergyman's robe and had one dark blue eye and one eye covered with blood vessels. The moment this night watcher appeared, he couldn't help but open his mouth and scoff at the classic quill in his hand. "If a fool like you didn't listen to my suggestion, how could something like this happen? I'm not even sure what you're afraid of. If you had allowed me to pray to the Lord, allowing me to secretly return to the Rose Redemption and join forces with that serpent, our preparations would allow us to set up a trap. Today, we will be the ones hunting Adam, as not the other way round." The seemingly dark and damaged quill immediately flew up and wrote on an empty spot of Zangwell's clothes. Due to a rage stemming from embarrassment, Sauron Einhorn Medici pushed the blame of this development to the quill of Alzuhad, but in fact, it was he who was stopping himself from praying to the true creator. Be it Sauron or Einhorn, neither one of them trusted this evil god. Today's development made this evil spirit's psychological dissociation to worsen. This is extremely reasonable. This is the diagnosis by the best, most professional psychiatrist. Zangwell immediately frowned as he raised his left hand and pressed it to his head. His dark blue eye rapidly recovered its luster as the classically sculpted face turned extremely stern. At this moment, having escaped the corpse cathedral, he was no longer facing the square. Instead, it was flights of ancient stone stairs. They were leading to the peak of a towering mountain. Erected there was a huge cross with countless angels spiraling around it. At this moment, an exaggerated bolt of silver lightning tore through the overcast sky, smiting right down at Insangwell. The sealed and strained space produced cracks. The fountain and its splashes appeared in his dark blue eye. Insangwell's figure immediately vanished, leaving behind a blurry transparent spirit. The latter was struck by lightning and was instantly obliterated. This night watcher didn't have the luxury of time to consider what other lurking dangers there were. He took this opportunity to transform into a flame as he penetrated a crack and rushed out. To him, no matter what lay ahead of him, nothing was more terrifying and difficult to deal with than the son of the Creator, King of Angels Adam. Upon seeing the flame rise up from the square, allowing Insangwell to escape the restraints of the illusory world and returning to his appearance with dark blonde hair and pale hands, Klein raised his head slightly and subconsciously sat straight. Countless scenes flashed across his mind, him having his heart penetrated, the pair of bright leather boots just before his previous death, Dunn Smith smiling at him with a wink of his left eye, and the Blackthorn Security Company which had been reduced to ruins. The corners of Klein's mouth quickly curled upwards as he revealed a comical smile. He then deeply muttered, using ancient Hermes, "Misfortune." The silver-grey charm on his right palm suddenly burst into a gloomy black light. This was a charm of the misfortune domain Klein made using Snake of Mercury or Septin's blood and precious metals by praying to the Evernight goddess. This was a present he had prepared for Insangwell. This was an arrow of vengeance. This was a deity's curse. Klein immediately stood up, stretched his shoulders, and threw out his right arm, fusing the gloomy black light with the little powers he could stir from above the grey fog as he threw them at Insangwell. Just as Insangwell returned to Revival Square, he saw a dark black beam appear out of nowhere. It blanketed the entire sky, making him find himself in an extremely dark environment. Get the latest novels on no/v/elbin.c/om. Such a change happened in a flash before everything was restored to normal in an instant. Nothing seemed amiss, but as a night watcher who could give others a certain level of bad luck, Insangwell acutely smelled the aura of danger. Without any hesitation, he reached out his left palm in a bid to use the evil spirit within him and his powers as a gatekeeper to enter the spirit world and flee. However, none of the surrounding bright flowers, pure white fountain, and dark black tiles had their colors saturate, much less become stacked. Insangwell's spirit world traversal had become ineffective. The glint in his eyes froze as he seemed to understand the reason. It was because the evil spirit in him was having an internal struggle, thus, they wouldn't lend him their power. See? Everything would be fine if you had listened to me. Bullshit. I'd rather die than believe in the true Creator. What's the point saying all of this? Didn't you still end up the same as us, being made into a potion by a Lister Tudor? So none of you are nervous at all? Didn't you notice that the curse clearly came with a deity's aura? That power was fundamentally very powerful. Our present condition doesn't allow us to avoid it at all. Ha ha, continue arguing. Go on. I'll wait to die with all of you. The veins on Insangwell's forehead throbbed when he heard that. He was furious that Sauron Einhorn Medici would suddenly engage in an internal strife at such a critical moment. They didn't seem to notice the danger they were in at all. As a former archbishop, as a beyonder who had watched over the Church of Evernight's holy artifacts, Insangwell didn't let his judgment become clouded because of his rage. He instinctively believed that the gloomy black beam had something to do with the Evernight goddess's authority over misfortune. He believed that Sauron Einhorn Medici's sudden fallout was clearly a result of this influence. Otherwise, it was impossible for the Red Angel evil spirit to break into a quarrel without concerning themselves with the situation they were in simply because of the Quill of Alzuhod's writing. He immediately turned around, quickly running towards another exit of Revival Square in an attempt to communicate with other spirits. He wished to borrow their powers to escape, however, there wasn't a single spirit around. At this moment, a figure stood in a hidden corner of the open square. He was a mixed blood with parents coming from Lun and Balaam. He had a fleshy face and baggy clothes. On his waist hung a rapier. It was Admiral Hel Ludwell. This was a marionette who usually didn't have any thoughts. After throwing out the deity's cursed charm, Klein followed his plan, returned to the real world, and made use of the two marionettes. As he made Enzo find a corner, he took out the items he prepared, set up a bestowment ritual, and controlled Admiral Hel to walk to a secluded spot to face in Sangwell. This Admiral Hel, who looked nothing like his original self, raised his right hand, allowing his arm and fingers to rapidly turn incorporeal as they extended towards the target. This was a power he used by borrowing the underworld creature within him to extract the spirit bodies of others remotely. Ludwell's palm quickly turned pale white, and above Ince Zangwell, a figure floated up uncontrollably. However, Ince Zangwell was once a gatekeeper. An illusory bronze door filled with mystery immediately took form in his eyes as it quickly pulled back his escaping spirit body. With his level and strength, this was unlikely to succeed so successfully, but for some reason, he repeatedly made mistakes and nearly allowed Admiral Hel to succeed. For a brief moment, all he could manage to do was a seesaw-like struggle. At this moment, two figures rapidly appeared beside Ludwell. One of them was the black-haired, green-eyed Leonard with a transparent glove in hand, and the other was Davy Simone, who had blue eyeshadow and blush. They had arrived at the perfect moment because the bad luck of an enemy often implied that one was lucky enough. The first thing Daly saw was the figure she could never forget. Pangs of fury burned in her eyes instantly. She didn't rashly attack as she made some observations. She came behind Ludwell and spread her arms. A bronze door filled with countless strange patterns immediately descended and creaked open a gap. This was a door that led to the underworld. It was a door filled with a lure to all undead creatures. An indescribable and terrifying suction force came out of it as the figure above Ince Zangwell's body completely separated from him. It was a translucent man wearing blood-stained black armor. He was young and handsome with red hair. His face had terrifying signs of decay, and at his glabella was a flag-like mark. This young man wasn't too surprised about being separated from Ince Zangwell. Instead, he sneered. "We sure are unlucky today. We have already died together once, so is there a need to do so another time? Especially when we're being controlled by such a weakling." A bloody gap appeared on his upper left cheek as it opened and closed. "All right, let's clear out the surrounding trash." Before the sentence was finished, the man in blood-stained black armor reached out his palm and drew out an illusory sword with dark red rust stains from his body. A terrifying suppressive force easily allowed the evil spirit to free itself from Ludwell's and Daly Simone's extraction. It swooped down in an attempt to return to Ince Zangwell's body. At this moment, a hoarse voice sounding as though it held sandcloth in it. Admiral Hel Ludwell had chanted in ancient Hermes, "Fate!" Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 943. Fate! In the awkward-sounding voice, the spots where Admiral Hel Ludwell and Night Watcher Ince Zangwell stood turned dark as if they were covered by two black clouds. Fate Siphon Charm. This was one of the Fate Siphon charms that Klein had made using the Worms of Time from Palace Zoroast. To make plans without 0-08's knowledge, he had kept himself hidden behind the scenes the entire time. Not only had he lent creeping hunger to Leonard Mitchell, he had also given the Fate Siphon charm to his marionette. Hence, the one who was possessed by the evil spirit had gone from Ince Zangwell to Ludwell. Admiral Hel instantly had Sauron Einhorn Medici's blood-stained, black-armored body plunge into him as his eyes became filled with minute blood vessels. Inside the hotel, Klein calmly controlled the marionette without showing any wavering or hesitation due to the impact the evil spirit had. Ludwell reached out to tear his clothes and raised the soul-soothing mask to cover his face. At the same time, having heard the Red Angel's words, and witnessing his actual condition, Daly Simone, who had suffered immense pressure, seemed to realize something. Not only did she not close the door to the underworld, she even gritted her teeth and used all her might to widen the gap. Bloody, skinless arms, slimy tentacles with teeth, and bluish-black vines with baby faces began emerging from the door to the underworld as they grabbed at Ludwell. This freed up Admiral Hell, who had planned on completing this step alone. Taking advantage of the opportunity that the underworld within his body hadn't yet been destroyed by Sauron Einhorn Medici, with the only negative effects on his body being decaying, he hurriedly turned around and dashed towards the mysterious, illusory bronze door. He was then grabbed on his body and legs by the arms, tentacles, vines, and spirits behind the door. With his running working hand in hand with the scalp-tingling tugs, he instantly leaped through the widened door gap and entered the underworld. Upon seeing this, Daly immediately pulled back her palm and stopped maintaining the mysterious patterned bronze door. Thud! The indescribable illusory door closed heavily. Admiral Hel Ludwall, along with Sauron Einhorn Medici, were kept out of the real world with the underworld creatures. This was a key step to Klein's plan. It was to forcibly separate the Red Angel evil spirit from Ince Zangwill. Although he believed that the Red Angel evil spirit was the reason for Ince Zangwill's instability, he wasn't willing to face an additional evil spirit formed after the deaths of one king of angels and two Sequence 1 angels when taking revenge on a demigod. No one could predict what actions a conspirer would take under such circumstances. Therefore, Klein used the basis of the magical powers of the Fate Siphon Charm and Ludwall's pathway characteristic to formulate a plan. The addition of Daly had allowed the entire process to happen more smoothly. There wasn't any room for being interrupted as they successfully pulled the Red Angel evil spirit into the underworld. This way, even if the evil spirit was able to possess Admiral Hell's body and travel back to the real world via spirit world traversal, it would be far into the future. After all, to leave the underworld required them to find an exit, and with the Evernight goddess wielding control over artificial death, she had a certain level of authority in the underworld. She was definitely not letting the Red Angel evil spirit leave so easily. Sacrificing a marionette, a high-level charm, and 2 mystical items in exchange for removing the Red Angel evil spirit from the battlefield was heart-wrenching for Klein, but it was definitely worth it. As for the misfortune on Ince Zangwill, on the one hand, it was a continuous state and not a short-term affliction, and on the other hand, he had suffered from deity's curse. The Fate Siphon Charm could only replace a tiny portion of that and not empty it out. He could soon recover. As for Ludwall, he had Winner Enzo imbuing him with good luck. Nothing would stop his series of actions for a short period of time. Such a change was completely unexpected for Leonard. However, he had become a Red Glove for almost a year. He had plenty of experience dealing with supernatural cases, so he didn't show any hesitation or confusion. He immediately cast his gaze at the still-dazed Ince Zangwill. When the figure in a black clergyman's robe with one dim eye was reflected in his eyes, his expression immediately warped as though he was facing a trauma of his. It was a trauma where he did his best but had failed to put it to use. It was the trauma of seeing Captain and Klein already dead after regaining consciousness. As Leonard raised his left palm, he pressed the human-skinned glove to his temple and grasped the Fate Siphon Charm in his right hand tightly. With a deep voice, he said, "Fate!" The ancient, supernatural language echoed as a transparent book condensed in front of his left glove. Following that, there was the ethereal chant of I came, I saw, I record. Bolts of bright, binding silver lightning blasted down one after another as they instantly devoured Leonard. Lightning storm. This was akin to Leonard holding a revolver to his temple before pulling the trigger. He was committing suicide, but at the same time, he was using the Fate Siphon Charm. This would transfer such a fate to Ince Zangwill. This was the best solution he could think of when using the Fate Siphon Charm and creeping hunger. It required immense courage. Countless silver lightning swept over, shattering the surrounding darkness. Leonard Mitchell immediately snapped awake and found himself still standing at his spot. His left hand had yet to rise, and his right hand had just grabbed the Fate Siphon Charm. Whatever he did was just a dream. At this moment, in Ince Zangwill's dark blue eyes, darkness was slowly swirling. It was as though it was saying, "When did you get the misconception that you aren't dreaming?" In fact, long before Sauron Einhorn Medici had been extracted from his body, he had already created a large-scale dream in an attempt to pull all his enemies in. Unfortunately, the man with a rapier was in no way affected. He easily escaped and ended up destroying the dream, reducing its effects to nothing. as the ability to detect danger which was gained from one's spiritual perception feedback was that obvious, and with the possibility of the conflict between the two kings of angels behind him spilling over at any moment, Zangwill didn't hesitate to create a large-scale slumber effect while pulling Daily Simone and Leonard Mitchell into a dream. Right on the heels of that, he picked up Quill of Alzuhod and rapidly wrote on his sleeve. Zangwill was in optimal condition today. He could effectively control his mythical creature form, therefore, he didn't hold back and used all his strength to escape the area. As he finished writing the sentence with the quill, Zangwill's body began transforming. His eyes instantly turned black as though it was tainted with ink. The fine patterns around him began to extend, forming strange and distorted mysterious symbols. At his waist and ribs, his clothes swelled as for skinless arms grew out from squirming flesh, they were covered with blood vessels. The arm was rapidly covered with white feathers as a cadaveric aura rippled out. At the same time, Zangwill's teeth grew long, turning sharp. His body seemed to be embedded with numerous blurry, tiny faces. This novelbin.com for new updates. In a blink of an eye, this Night Watcher was already slumped on the ground, turning into a strange monster with 8 legs and white feathers. Night suddenly fell upon the square as worms in the soil and the bacteria on the floor tiles died one after another, entering an eternal slumber. This was the combination of the powers of Evernight and Death. Just as Daily Simone and Leonard Mitchell were about to lose their lives amidst their slumber, a thunderclap boomed. Bolts of silver lightning struck down, turning into a forest of lightning that blanketed Zangwill's incomplete mythical creature form. After sending away the Red Angel evil spirit, Klein didn't stay any longer. Like a marionette with preset orders, he mechanically took 4 steps counterclockwise and entered above the grey fog. Wearing the papal tiara and papal robe again, he picked up the Sea God Scepter. This was the 3rd act of the play. With 0-08 exhausted by Adam, and with the Red Angel evil spirit separated from Zangwill thanks to the Fate Siphon charm, he had to face the Sea God's wrath as a sequence 4. Klein knew that he didn't have the strength to directly fight a demigod. Therefore, his plan had been to wear off Zangwill's helpers while smiting him from above the grey fog. It was akin to the sea battle with the demigod, Kona's Kilga, who was from the Black Emperor pathway back then. Even if he couldn't complete the kill due to a demigod's potency, he could stall for time until the Church of Evernight's archbishop or high-ranking deacons with sealed artifacts arrived. In this plan, there were 2 uncontrollable parameters. First, it was unpredictable how much influence 0-08 had towards the end. A card up his sleeve was to let Enzo set up a bestowment ritual and be prepared to send Grozel's travels to the real world at any time. By sending it to the edge of the battle, Klein wanted to know if this would lure the quill away from Zangwill. After all, he guessed that the quill was a Grade O sealed artifact of the Spectator pathway. It was likely that it was interested in the special book left behind by the Dragon of Imagination. Second, he wasn't sure how strong the son of the Creator, Adam, was. Klein had no reference point, and he believed that it wasn't impossible for a king of angels like him to subdue 0-08, imprison the Red Angel evil spirit, and kill Zangwill alone. Towards such a development, Klein had no means to foil it. All he could do was pray for the goddess's blessings and fate's tenderness as he waited for the outcome. Rumble. The lightning forest smoked down, bringing with it intense destructive auras. At this moment, pure darkness surged out of the gaps in the lightning, devouring all of the silver-white swath. Right on the heels of that, Zangwill's 8 legs moved rapidly as he ran out of the area. He couldn't find a target of attack, nor could he lock onto the enemy that had cast Lightning Storm. Holding back his furious emotions, he ran towards buildings along the perimeter of the square, leaving shadowy afterimages behind. However, amidst booming thunder, terrifying lightning bolts smote down one after another, trapping Zangwill inside the square. Daly and Leonard had already woken up from their dreams, but the light from the lightning affected their vision, allowing them to discover that Zangwill had apparently turned into a monster, but the details were unclear. Mythical creature form. As the two had a solid foundation in mysticism, they immediately realized what was happening and quickly closed their eyes. They then retreated to a spot that provided them shelter. Realizing that he was unable to dodge the lightning strike given the amount of time he had, Zhangwil retracted one of his legs, picked up 0-08, and as he ran, he wrote on his body. An unknown existence is attracted by the combat and feels great pity for Zhangwil's experiences before deciding to help him by taking him away via the spirit world. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 944. On the heavily scuffed and damaged Revival Square, the environment turned dark as a gloominess and eeriness filled it in a seemingly corporeal manner. Even the blinding silver lightning wasn't able to dispel this feeling. Daily Simone acutely sensed that an unknown creature was crossing the spirit world and approaching. An ominous feeling rose up in her as though she could already see Zhangwil using such an accident to easily escape, never to be found. She felt ice-cold in a manner that couldn't be resisted, just like when she first became a Beyonder. Back then, due to a particular accident, as a 19-year-old, she had lost her family and ended up drinking a potion by mistake. She ended up becoming a corpse collector and was placed into a Nighthawks team. The influence of the potion and the wounds from losing her family had made her enjoy gloominess and coldness. She couldn't help but approach corpses, often loitering in cemeteries and sleeping there. This made her appear odd, with people instinctively avoiding her. This not only dropped her body temperature, but it also slowly froze her heart and soul as they turned ice-cold. She was afraid of this feeling. She still hoped to live as a person, hence, she instinctively used how men coveted her for her looks and body to gain a boyfriend. She wanted to use the warmth of a body to stop her soul from turning cold. In this decadent and surreal life, she met that man, a man who always warmly listened to her. He was a man who always stayed by her side and provided her help. He was a man who became embarrassed when faced with jokes involving the two sexes. He was a man who accepted all the flaws and weaknesses of his teammate with a sincere attitude. He was a man who fumbled in helplessness when she jested at him again and again. He was a man who hid the pain and sorrow in his heart, to the point of suffering an early receding hairline. He was a man who was the first to step forward when encountering danger, putting himself in between the danger and his teammates. She changed. She began putting on makeup that made her appear older. She stopped mixing with other men, but kept her jokes to deliberately express that she hadn't changed in an obvious manner. However, she still didn't make it in time. She didn't manage to witness the man master the acting method, digest potions, and advance to sequence 6. She didn't manage to see him reach out his hand to invite her to an opening dance or be able to participate in his final battle. She didn't manage to tell him her feelings in time. I was wrong. I failed to do anything in time. Today, I'm not having it repeat again. Daly's expression turned sorrowful as the corners of lips curled bit by bit with tenderness and sweetness. With her eyes closed, she suddenly pulled out a small metal bottle from a hidden compartment. She threw the stopper and gulped the liquid inside. Her blue eyeshadow and blush instantly brightened, and even her skin turned slightly translucent. Her coiled-up hair was instantly released, pushing her hood back as they fluttered. Spirit wandering the void, higher-order creature that leave one with awe, the unforeseeable creature, Daly chanted with simple and forceful ancient Hermes, I shall sign a contract with you in my name, pray that you leave this place. Behind the eight-legged, the white-feathered Zhangwil, a figure appeared. It was a blood-colored piece of flesh with countless eyes on it and arms of different races. Just as it was about to grab Zhangwil and drag him into the spirit world, it suddenly paused. It then turned its gaze towards Daily Simone. Pitch-black snake-like scales instantly appeared on Daly's skin, and within the gaps of the scales, white feathers grew. Her knees buckled as she knelt down in pain, but she ultimately maintained her spirit-channeling posture. That quill began writing autonomously on Zhangwil's body. The unknown existence descended upon Revival Square and was just about to take Zhangwil away, but no, it was attracted by Daily Simone. Its sense of aesthetics was inclined towards humans. Oh no, it abandoned Zhangwil. It decided to listen to Daily Simone's suggestion and ended up leaving. How surprising that when it came to spirit channeling, Zhangwil, a demigod, would actually lose to sequence 5 Daily Simone. Although this lady had consumed the flower of spirit and paid an immense price, she had little chance to defeat Int Zangwill, who was barely using the quill of Alzuhad. Int Zangwill was just too unlucky. He actually encountered a matter with nearly zero probability. Amidst the lightning strikes, blood-red beams lit up in Int Zangwill's pitch-black eyes that were covered with mysterious symbols before calming down. His hand, which held the quill, wrote on his body once again. Another unknown existence was lured into the vicinity and attempted to enter the real world. Just as he wrote that, the quill suddenly paused as it continued writing. Incoming. Incoming. No, she was Rionette Tinker. No, Rionette Tinker chased away all the surrounding creatures in the spirit world. She gave Int Zangwill a glance, looked away, and left, continuing to her patrol of the surroundings. Int Zangwill is too unlucky, just too unlucky. Int Zangwill's rapidly moving body suddenly paused as though he had suffered a terrible blow. Boom! A thick bolt of silver-white lightning smote the eight-legged monster. It sent Int Zangwill flying up as he let out an inhuman cry. In his pitch-black eyes, the blood-red beam spread out like an explosion, turning into two bloodthirsty, cruel, and maniacal blobs of light. Int Zangwill could no longer control his emotions and maintain a good state of mind. He lost most of his reason. The more the slightly damaged quill wrote, the darker it became until it slowly stopped. With a scream that left one with goosebumps, an endless darkness blanketed the area, pulling Daily Simone and Leonard Mitchell into a dream. However, the thunder booms and lightning snapped the dreamers awake. Int Zangwill took a step back with his 8 legs, leaving behind an afterimage in his spot. He rapidly ran towards Daily Simone, who was on the brink of losing control, hoping to rip apart the Nighthawk who had foiled his plans for escaping. Boom! Boom! Ridiculous bolts of lightning blasted down, stopping his attempts to escape. Rare latest chapters on no/v/e/l/b-in.com. Boom! Boom! The 8 legs that were covered with white feathers, which now had signs of being charred, moved one after another as he kept his body low while he circled the square, dodging the lightning in search for an opportunity to kill Leonard and Daly. With time, he realized there was a problem with the remaining reason that he had. The frequency of the lightning was dropping. The person that kept casting lightning strike had apparently reached his limit, and his spirituality was almost drained. Int Zangwill's heart stirred as a cruel smile was plastered across his face. He ran at high speeds as he muttered in ancient Faesak, "All of you will die." He had apparently forgotten of his need to escape. All of you will die. Leonard Mitchell could do nothing despite hearing that sentence. It was because he couldn't even open his eyes. He couldn't determine where Int Zangwill was, nor use his spirituality to lock onto him. At this moment, he felt as if he had returned to Tingen, back to the Blackthorn Security Company, back to the day where they engaged Megos in an intense battle. He had returned to the time when he was weak and helpless, unable to stop anything himself. Back then, he clearly wanted to help Captain and Klein. Despite overcoming his horror, despite having Old Man to provide him with help, he quickly fainted due to his low sequence and lacking strength, thus failing to participate in the subsequent battle. All he could do was wake up to see 2 corpses and use the pain of meeting family members to resolve the blame he placed on himself. He always cherished his leisurely life in Tingen City, the feeling of not needing to take any responsibility as if he was the protagonist. However, the more he cherished those memories, the more he hated his former self, wondering why he hadn't worked harder. With his eyes tightly closed, figures of light were darting around, and all he could do was ball his hands into a fist as he hurriedly shouted, "Old Man! Old Man!" This time, there wasn't any response in his mind. No one provided him any help, as Palace Zoroast was still in a deep sleep. Leonard's breathing turned heavy as he couldn't help but move his head from side to side with the darting of the light. Then, with a slightly hoarse voice, he shouted in clear anxiety, "Old Man! Old Man! Old Man!" His voice gradually softened, drowned by the thunder. Leonard hung his head bit by bit, his face filled with shame and pain. His lips quivered as he relaxed his hand and gripped it tight again. His entire body froze for several seconds. Suddenly, he wore a firm expression. With a grimace, he opened his mouth and chanted softly in ancient Hermes, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era." The mysterious ruler above the grey fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck. Just as he said the prayers, he magically saw a scene in his mind. Zangwell, who had seemingly turned into a spider or some deformed feather wolf, was running frantically and dodging the lightning strikes. From time to time, he attempted to attack him and Daily Simone. And unlike normally, Zangwell's figure appeared rather blurry in this scene. It was almost completely represented by red light, and it could only be used to determine his location. Leonard was first taken aback as he immediately laughed. Teardrops flowed down as he laughed. Without any hesitation, he raised his left palm, pressed the glove to his temple, and then tightly gripped the fate siphon charm with his right hand. Fate! The incomprehensible, mysterious word in ancient Hermes resounded as a transparent book appeared in front of Leonard. It flipped to a page amidst the ethereal chanting of "I came, I saw, I record," as he locked onto the eight-legged monster with white feathers growing all over him. Silver bolts of lightning blasted as Leonard Mitchell threw out the charm with a hideous expression, shouting, "Die!" Zangwill. He had waited to say this for a very, very long time. He had played this scene in his head so many times. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 945. The moment the fate siphon charm left Leonard Mitchell's hand, it vanished into midair, its whereabouts unknown. It cloaked the spots where he and Zangwill stood in darkness. Even the burgeoning silver storm was unable to illuminate it. At that instant, Leonard felt the surface of his body turn numb, as though lightning was leaping over it, creating a slight stabbing pain, one that would completely pulverize his body at any moment. But following that, he didn't get bombarded with irresistible pain, as though nothing had happened. No, something did happen. A bolt of lightning smote down at him as if it had bared its fangs, shattering the ground and charring the soil. Klein had personally redirected his casting of Lightning Storm from Zangwill when Leonard Mitchell used the Fate Siphon charm. Ah! A shrill scream sounded as the rich darkness around Zangwill failed to dissipate the storm that was formed from a mesh of silver lightning bolts. His body was swept into the heart of the storm. He had suffered the fate of Leonard Mitchell being devoured by the lightning storm ability. Boom! The thunder boomed deeply as the lightning forest quickly dissipated, but before the lightning storm came to a complete end, more bolts of silver lightning smote down from the sky, causing a new wave of attacks. Boom! 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 The wrath of a thunder god smote down again and again as the lightning's frequency returned to normal. There weren't any gaps in between. Even though there were waves of darkness surging out from Zangwill's position, they were unable to obliterate the silver swath. After a few lightning storms, the blinding light finally dimmed. The minute bolt snaked around weakly. Zangwill remained standing there without collapsing. However, his head with pitch-black eyes, blood-red halos, and mysterious symbols had cracked. The flesh inside the cracks was charred black as a greyish-white liquid seeped out. The full legs by his torso had already been burnt black and curled up together. All it took was a touch for them to fall off. On them, not only were the white feathers gone, even the overlapping blood vessels were pulverized and had scattered to the ground, leaving them at head height with him. But even so, Zangwill still wasn't dead. Creatures that had obtained guard had had an unimaginable vitality compared to ordinary people. The blood-red halo in his eyes grew richer as the violent aura no longer had any room for decreasing. Feelings of hatred and regret surged in him, giving him the urge to vent them out. He hated himself for only thinking of escaping in the beginning and not killing all the enemies present. Back then, if he hadn't held back and had used his powers by releasing the terror of a demigod without any reservations, he was definitely able to kill Daily Simone and Leonard Mitchell amidst the lightning strikes. If he had done so, he wouldn't have been left in such a sorry state by two mid-sequence beyond us. Damn it! Damn it! Zangwill roared and threw away the darkened 0-08 quill. Using his remaining full legs, he pounced at Leonard Mitchell. Leonard was just about to take action when he felt a coldness in him. It was as though thin, long hair was reaching out and binding him from the darkness, doing so from a dream. He was unable to move again. Boom! A bolt of lightning struck into Zangwill, but it only served to stagger him for a moment and drop a few pieces of charred flesh. He continued his attack and even revealed a cruel smile. From that strike, he was already certain that the person hiding in the background casting the lightning was at their limit. The person was unable to use any more demigod-level powers. As for Leonard, who was being bound by countless strands of invisible hair, his thoughts quickly became serene. It was as though he no longer put up any resistance and had wished to sleep in the darkness. Unable to move, he bit his tongue lightly and temporarily recovered some of his lucidity. He made the transparent book in front of him emit the ethereal chanting, "I came, I saw, I record." With a resonating whoosh, a terrifying hurricane swept at Zangwill, who had arrived with a pounce. It snapped the illusory black hair-like objects, giving Leonard freedom again. Whoosh! Zangwill was thrown up as he slammed heavily to the ground. His body was covered with deep gashes as pale white blood gushed out of him. Despite having lost another front leg, he still wasn't dead. He stood up again and locked onto the Evernite poet who still had his eyes closed. Without any warning, Leonard suddenly slipped and fell to the ground. When he tried to get up, he seemed unable to maintain his balance. Even the gale he created had failed to sweep up his body. Damn it! I should have killed you when you were unconscious back in Tingen City. Zangwill cursed through clenched teeth. That woman is about to die. The same goes for you. As he cursed, he hobbled over to Leonard's location as though he had lost his ability to move at rapid speeds. With a ferocious expression, he said, "Your captain was irritating. Likewise for that teammate of yours. All of you are the same. After I kill you, I'll leave this place and return to Tingen to dig up their graves." As he cursed, the darkness filled with cadaveric auras surged out of Zangwill, sweeping towards the nearby Leonard Mitchell. Leonard could sense that he was riddled with bad luck, but he could do nothing. He didn't even dare to open his eyes. Bang! Amidst a gunshot, a pale golden bullet pierced through the thick deathly darkness, bringing out blinding sunlight, terminating the abnormality within. Pa! Tarot cards flew over, stabbing into the ground at different spots. One of the cards landed in front of Leonard as it burst into scarlet flames. Amidst the flames, a figure wearing a half-top hat and black suit walked out with a revolver in hand. With a bookish demeanor, he had black hair and brown eyes, with a face with a deep outline. He was none other than Klein Moretti. Unable to use the Sea God Scepter anymore, he had decisively returned to the real world. He had rushed here with Death Knell. It's really you. You really are still alive. Die together with them. Zangwill's movement speed instantly recovered as he circled around Klein, trying to forcefully pull him into a dream. He had been acting. However, Klein was completely unaffected. He didn't show signs of falling asleep as he raised his right hand and pulled the trigger as though he had foreseen it. Bang! Zangwill was thrown to the ground by a powerful impact. The cracks on his head widened. That shot was from Daly, Klein said in a deep voice as he snapped his fingers. Using the flames that burst up, he flashed to the side of Zangwill. Zangwill's eyes protruded out. As he moved at high speeds, he released bad luck in a bid to influence Klein, but it was completely useless. This shot is for Leonard. All the tarot cards were ignited at the same time, like bursting fireworks. Klein flashed behind Zangwill, cocked the gun, and relying on his intuition, he pulled the trigger. Bang! Pale white blood spurted out of Zangwill's left leg as it broke. His running came to an abrupt stop as he even failed to maintain his balance. Using the burning tarot cards, he repeatedly cast Flaming Jump, preventing himself from entering the influence of the black hair. This shot is for Megos. This shot is for the Keepers. This shot is for the destroyed Blackthorn Security Company. This shot is for all the Nighthawks. This shot is for me. Amidst the gunshots, Klein kept pulling the trigger and did the corresponding reloading as he shot demon-hunting bullets. he blew through another of Zangwill's legs, blasting open his forehead, causing his roars to turn into a whimper until he fell onto the ground. Finally, Klein flashed in front of Zangwill. He then held death knell to his face. At this moment, mysterious patterns accentuated Zangwill's almost cracked head, creating an immense impact. He still had the ability to resist. He was waiting for him to approach and then use his mythical creature form to turn the tables. However, Klein's brown eyes continued looking at him without reflecting anything. He thrust death knell forward and pulled the trigger. Bang! Zangwill's head completely exploded, and like a smashed watermelon, the fragments and the juice splattered everywhere. Death knell had sounded the knell for him. Klein raised his left hand and rubbed away his two eyes. The real eyes that hid beneath were moved back to their original spots. His brown eyes had blurred up. He curled the corners of his mouth bit by bit and said to the already dead Zangwill softly, "This shot is for Captain." He didn't give Zangwill a chance to leave any last words. He had no wish to know what bitter past the latter had experienced. New chapters will be fully updated at n/el/bin.com. He then took out one remaining tarot card from his pocket and threw it on Zangwill's corpse. It was an inverted the star card. At this moment, a figure appeared not far from him. He bent down and picked up the darkened quill. This figure wore a simple white robe and had a pale gold beard that covered half his face. On his chest hung a silver cross as though he was the most ordinary priest, but he was the king of angels, Adam. Adam looked at Klein and said with a genial smile, "Unfortunately, I failed to retain the snake." He looked at the quill in his hand and then at the tarot card. He smiled and added, "A price is always exacted for what fate bestows, one, isn't that so?" With that said, he turned around and slowly disappeared from the ruined square with each step he took. He left the following words as though he sang it. Under the witness of a spectator, Klein Moretti completed a grand performance, directing a magical murder. With that, he managed to digest his potion with enough energy left to attempt an advancement before the curtains fell. Klein didn't take in the feeling of his marionettist potion's digestion and the corresponding feedback. With a flaming jump, he arrived in front of Daily Simone. The lady was already on the brink of losing control. She said in a daze, "I don't want to become a monster." "All right." Klein looked at her with a sorrowful gaze as he quickly thought of the means to rescue a rampager. He had considered getting her to chant the fool's honorific name before pulling her spirit body above the grey fog, but with her body already mutating, it was apparently useless. The only way was for Daly to choose to remain there forever. As for the flower of blood, it was also unable to resolve such problems. Daly smiled with great difficulty as she resisted the white feathers and pitch-black scales that kept growing out of her. "So it's you? Didn't you ask me why I didn't take the initiative to confess to Dunn, to throw him in bed?" She gasped for air and said with a bitter smile, "I had indulged myself too much in the past. He was a conservative man. I felt inferior." She couldn't hold out much longer, with the outcome of her becoming a monster happening at any moment. At this moment, she heard Klein Moretti reply, "Captain actually liked you too, very much. Because you were too outstanding and young, he felt inferior as well." Daly smiled as her blurry gaze saw a man in a black trench coat with a receding hairline. He had dark grey eyes. She watched as he pressed his hand to his chest, bent down, and reached out his palm to invite her to a dance. She reached out her hand as her thoughts turned sluggish. The grey-eyed man in a black trench coat pulled up Daly, whose mutation was slowly fading away. Under Leonard's watch, they danced a brisk dance in the destroyed square with the fountain spewing water everywhere. One material after another flew out. There were golden grapevines and a rather ugly rubber mask. Under the guidance of spirituality, they slowly mixed together and entered a small metal bottle. Amidst the beautiful dance, Daly leaned forward gently, resting herself in Dunn's embrace. Klein held the potion bottle, brought it to his mouth, and downed it. One quote from Stefan Zweig. Lord of the Mysteries, Chapter 946. The ice-cold potion slid down his throat, bringing Klein numbness, one that reached deep into his soul. He had already stopped dancing. His mind seemed to be lifted as though he was high in the air, looking down at the ruined Revival Square, at Kokawa City, which had been left in shambles by the repeated lightning strikes. At this moment, he felt his emotions rouse up for some baffling reason, as all the pedestrians below seemed to be connected to him by some invisible threads. They could be happy, angry, or sad, making all kinds of actions based on his directions. Klein often had such feelings recently. He knew that this was the vision of a director. By viewing all participants as marionettes or actors, he attempted to control or guide them into putting on a grand performance. Using that hint of familiarity, Klein hurriedly adjusted his state of mind, completely separating his emotions from it and viewing everything in a cold, aloof manner, so as to prevent himself from being affected by the play. As a director, he followed the script, referred to reality, and rationally made an analysis to choose according to the circumstances. He allowed emotions to build up, allowing himself to push matters forward and use the clues that had developed. Once his state of mind settled, he felt the potion's power spread across his body like a sharp-threaded net. Suddenly, Klein felt that his soul body was connected to his physical body. They were split into countless parts, and without being able to hold it in any longer, he let out a cry from deep within his soul. No. His thoughts were diced apart, turning into fragments as they fused with different pieces of flesh as he gained his own sentience. These included Klein with pain, Klein with arrogance, Klein with coldness, Klein with gentleness, Klein who could amusement himself, as well as Ju Mingrue, Sherlock Moriarty, German Sparrow, and Dwayne Dantes. His entire spirit body seemed to be thrown into a grinding machine. Not far away, Leonard, whose cheeks were streaming with unconscious tears, first saw Captain Dunn, who was embracing Daily Simone, transform back into Klein Moretti. Following that, he noticed his face, neck, and the back of his hands. Pale-colored tendrils protruded out as though they had a life of their own. They kept growing outwards, turning into a transparent maggot. And beneath his clothes, there were also signs of squirming. This made Leonard have the feeling that Klein would collapse into a cluster of transparent maggots the next second as they raced in different directions. Just as he wanted to do something, he felt dizzy. He instinctively closed his eyes and didn't dare to keep watching. The transparent maggots that grew out of Klein's body shimmered under the sunlight, producing three-dimensional layers of mysterious symbols. They connected to higher and lower levels, directly presenting the abstract concepts of bizarreness, madness, change, strength, and wisdom. Amidst howling cold winds, black illusory threads rose up around Klein as they bonded together, forming strange tentacles. The tentacles flailed as his soul body, astral projection, body of heart and mind, and ether body were reduced to fragments as they fused with the different maggots that represented Klein's various thoughts, turmoil, and dilemmas. As they wafted between them gently, they seemed to fly up to an infinite height where there were countless illusions hugging huge distorted buildings. They were either playing wind instruments, giving speeches, growling, or raving. Amidst Klein's countless chaotic senses, everything around him stacked together as though they turned into the spirit world. However, there were living people coming and going with the stars shining upon them. At this moment, the fragments filled with thoughts had similar memories appear, fresh memories. It was of King of Angels Adam praying with his eyes closed. It was the scene of his shocking appearance. It was him using Death Knell against Int Zangwill as he pulled the trigger to blast open his head. Raya latest chapters on no/v/e/lb-in.com. It was when he revealed his clown smile, saying in a deep voice, "This shot is for Captain." It was when spectator Adam used an extremely clear and innocent eye to take in the ending of the performance. It was of him turning into Dunn Smith, inviting Daily Simone to dance the closing dance. They were also fresh on his mind, especially the gaze of a spectator. There was a seemingly corporeal feedback that felt like a magnetic force. It made Klein gradually discover his sense of self-awareness once again. I? Who am I? This was a question that Klein had an answer to when he was still a faceless. He didn't need to think too much about it as he quickly understood his identity. A person from Earth, a person who had been reconstructed from Klein's memory fragments. A person whose experience as a nighthawk deeply influenced him. A person who played safe and was afraid of danger, but was able to persist and give up everything. A guardian and a miserable wretch. Strange sensory organs that didn't come from the body of heart and mind or soul body were extracted bit by bit from the fragments, condensing Klein's new thoughts: coldness, calmness, spectating, and overlooking. They were thoughts that allowed him to view the world from even more angles and dimensions. He knew that this could possibly be godhood. Without putting up any resistance, he chained the original spirit body fragments with black threads, allowing him to slowly take form again. At this moment, he realized the purpose of the advancement ritual. It was a mark, an anchor. Compared to other pathways, the bizarro sorcerer, who experienced the fragmentation of their soul bodies, required an anchor much earlier. However, this didn't require the support of any faith. On the contrary, faith was a numerous and jumbled affair with too many personal feelings involved. During the fragmentation during this ritual, it easily wiped away the humanity of the advancer, who was only sequence 5, leaving behind godhood. A grand and profound performance under the watch of countless spectators was enough to make up this anchor. Although the spectators were few in number, as the pinnacle existence of the spectator pathway, Adam could match thousands of ordinary spectators. He could even imagine a theater of spectators to create the effect. With his entire body taking form, all kinds of knowledge surged out from the depths of his demigod spirit body, embroiling Klein's mind and giving him an indescribable impact. It felt as though his brain was about to explode. However, with some level of godhood and his rich experience, he could view this in a detached manner and rather easily pass through this stage. The transparent maggots on his face, hands, neck, and beneath his clothes returned into his body, turning back into the black-haired, brown-eyed Klein Moretti. Looking at Daily Simone, who was still in his embrace and slowly turning cold, he lifted her up and walked to Leonard Mitchell. He bent down and placed her on the ground. Daily no longer had pitch-black scales or white feathers. She had been restored to normal and her eyes were closed. The corners of her mouth were curled up like she was having the deepest and sweetest dream. Klein stood up and looked at Leonard, who had opened his eyes again, and said heavily, "She has returned to the goddess's kingdom, just like Captain." He had turned her into a marionette to reverse Daily's mutation, allowing her to die like a human before releasing his control over her. Leonard tried to force a smile as he whimpered a sound of acknowledgement. Tears were streaming down his face. Klein gently nodded his head. To her, this might not be the worst outcome. She returned as a human to the embrace of a deity she believes in, and that's where Captain and the others are. As he spoke, he subconsciously and sincerely raised his right hand and tapped his chest 4 times in a clockwise fashion. Leonard instinctively drew the sign of the crimson moon. He was momentarily taken aback as his expression turned odd. Klein surveyed the area and said, "Take Daily back with you to East Balam. Make it known that she died due to Insangwil's attack and had made exceptional contributions in causing Insangwil's death. Don't worry, no one will investigate you. Of course, you can take this opportunity to leave the red gloves." "I am used to the church," Leonard said heavily. Klein took off his hat and bade farewell with a bow. Holding his hat, he turned to walk to Insangwil's body and took a card that had a chariot and a red priest on it. The red priest wore the face of Roselle Gustave. Leonard's lips quivered as he suddenly asked, "Aren't you returning to the church?" Klein didn't turn around as he wore his silk top hat and headed for another exit of the square. After a few steps, he paused and replied to Leonard with his back facing him. "I can't return anymore." "Can't return anymore?" Leonard stared in a daze as the familiar figure gradually distanced himself and vanished. After a while, a few beyond us flew to Revival Square. One of them was wearing the clergyman robes of the Church of Evernight. She had a head of beautiful raven black hair and an exquisite face. No one could tell her age, because no one cared. They could only notice the eyes that seemed to contain countless stars within. This lady was floating in midair as she looked at the square. All she saw was Insangwil's sorry corpse that could hardly be recognized. Covering his cracked head was a common Lacine tarot card. It was the star. Above the grey fog, Klein placed the red priest card by his left hand and closed his eyes to rest for a moment. He had a basic grasp and understanding of the powers of a bizarro sorcerer. On the one hand, he could transform into animals that weren't too disparate in size. In a spirit body state, he could completely ignore this point. He could transfer wounds from either himself or others onto a paper figurine. He had also gained the enhancement of the flaming jump ability that now spanned nearly 1,000 meters. The might of air bullet reached that of a cannon. On the other hand, he could now obtain initial control of one spirit body threads in 3 seconds. He could turn a target into his marionette within 15 seconds. His control range was 150 meters. At the same time, he could switch spirit body threads, allowing his marionette to obtain all his Beyonder powers. Within 1,000 meters, he could switch locations with his marionette as he wished. Due to this point, and the maggots he separated as a mythical creature form, as well as the disguise from the spirit body threads, Klein obtained a higher level of body doubles. This also meant that, as long as any one of his marionettes were alive, a bizarro sorcerer would never die. The enemy often found it difficult to know if the one killed was the bizarro sorcerer or his marionette. What was real and what wasn't was difficult to determine. After confirming his state and resting for a moment, Klein immediately walked deep into the mysterious space above the grey fog. He headed for the staircase of light that seemed to lead to heaven. As he expected, there was another step, one formed of light. This time, Klein believed that he could use this 6th step that resembled a giant's to step onto the condensed grey cloud. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. He came to the end and, with a leap, stepped onto the cloud formed by the grey fog. Reflecting in his eyes was a door of light tainted with a bluish-black luster. It was formed from countless layers of spherical light, and each spherical light enveloped squirming maggots. Some of them were transparent, others translucent. This was the scene Klein saw through Enzo's eyes, but the objects were very blurry, as though something was obstructing his vision. In addition, above the door of light, there were thin black threads that hung down. They were hanging up what seemed like completely transparent cocoons. These cocoons were gently swaying, wrapping different souls. They looked to be of all descents: African, Asian, Caucasians, etc. Some were wearing jeans, others holding cell phones. Some had beautiful clothes, others having beautiful facial features. All of them had the aura as though they were living, but their eyes were tightly closed. Klein's gaze froze as though he had returned to Earth and had walked onto the streets which were filled with people. Then, he noticed that 3 cocoons had opened. They were empty and were swaying with the wind. Raising his head, Klein took in this sight as he observed in silence. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 947. Backlund, East Borough, in a 2-room apartment. A few policemen in black and white checkered uniforms opened the door and entered. All of them reached out to cover their mouths. There was a strong stench of blood inside. "Officer, I've no idea what happened." Other tenants said that it seems like there's plenty of blood here, that they can even smell it from next door. The landlord with a silk top hat looked around in fear, unwilling to stay in the room for another second. A black-haired, blue-eyed police officer with an inspector epaulette waved his hand and said, "Wait by the door. We still have questions for you." As he spoke, he wore his white gloves and cast his gaze towards the wooden door of the bedroom. However, he wasn't in a rush to enter. He slowly surveyed the area and visually took in the surroundings: a pile of coal, a cupboard with cutlery and food, a small stove, a cleanly washed iron pot, a somewhat greasy table, 2 collapsed circular stools, 2 slanted chairs, a few glass bottles with unknown powders, and a stack of scattered tarot cards. A mysticism enthusiast with an ordinary financial situation? The black-haired, blue-eyed inspector nodded gently as he made a judgment. Then, he signaled for a subordinate to open the bedroom door. With a creak, a stronger smell of blood gushed out. The constable who opened the door looked in and let out a short exclamation as he repeatedly retreated. The inspector frowned. He pressed the retreating constable's shoulders, circled around him, and approached the bedroom. When he swept his gaze, his expression immediately changed. In the bedroom, on a wooden bed, there was a man lying there. His hands were tied to the bedpost. He was naked with deep and shallow marks on his body. His blood had long been drained, dyeing the bedsheet and blanket beside him dark red. On a cursory glance, the deceased had apparently been bound by metal wire, cutting into his skin and flesh, right into his bones. This scene still affected the policeman who had seen many murder scenes. Furthermore, it had a diabolical feeling like it was a ritual. As the inspector was about to say something, two people rushed into the room. One of them attempted to take photos while the other bombarded him with questions. Another murder case? Hasn't there been many murder cases in East Borough recently? Officer, do you think it's a serial murder? The black-haired, blue-eyed inspector frowned and waved his hand. Do not interfere with the scene, otherwise, we will view you as the criminal's accomplice. He then said to the constable from before, Kazakhs, please escort the two reporters away. Tell them that if they have any questions, ask the news department of Civilhouse Yard. After the reporters were escorted out of the crime scene, the inspector let out a long sigh. I'm going on the newspapers again. Damn it. In Empress Borough, the opulent villa of Earl Hall. Another murder in East Borough. The victim is suspected to have been abused before being killed. Having had dinner, Audrey was in the activity room casually reading the Backland Evening News. Upon hearing his daughter's soft muttering, Earl Hall shook his head and sighed. This isn't new in East Borough. The statistics show that there are people dying every day in there. It's far from one person. Audrey didn't pay too much attention to the matter. After a casual chat with her parents and brother, she returned to her room with her golden retriever, Susie. The human and dog could read each other's minds without any exchanging of words. The latter stood by the door as a guard while Audrey locked the door. She sat by her bed and chanted Mr. Fool's honorific name. After a few seconds, she saw a dark red beam of light surge and drown everything. Audrey arrived above the grey fog, coming inside the magnificent and ancient palace. She then saw a small room to the side. The mottled door was ajar. It's much better than the old confessional from before. However, this doesn't match Mr. World's character. Did something happen to his state of mind? In thought, Audrey entered the room and closed the mottled door. She had previously had a follow-up appointment with the World German Sparrow and concluded that he had fully recovered. To her surprise, she received a request from him for another treatment. This left her puzzled as she felt a little intrigued. In the rather spacious dark room, Audrey leaned against the wall that obviously had another person behind it. Her body slowly slid down as she knelt down with her legs placed diagonally. In the calm and serene atmosphere, she adjusted her state of mind and said with a brisk tone, "Good evening, Mr. World Tilda." Just as she said that, Audrey's spiritual intuition already knew the situation with his body of heart and mind, or in common parlance, his emotions or mood. Gloomy, disheartened, confused, depressed, and having no interest in anything. Mr. World's current problem is completely different from the last one. What happened this time? Audrey gently bit her lip and calmly made a judgment and used to timely placate. This was the most useful power of a psychiatrist. In ancient times, it was called psychoanalysis. F0 Low new chapters at november/el/bin/.com. The dark clouds behind the wall scattered significantly. German Sparrow finally hoarsely said, "Good evening, Miss Justice." Leaning against the wall, Audrey thought and cancelled her original plan. She maintained her brisk tone and said, "I'm very curious about your recent experiences. It seems you have had too many encounters. There's no need to think about anything else. Let's have a chat first, just like we're friends. If you're interested in my life, I'm also willing to share with you some of the interesting matters." On the opposite side of the wall, German Sparrow fell silent for a moment. Without answering the question, he asked, "What hopes do you have for the future?" Audrey's eyes darted slightly to the side as she replied seriously, "To advance myself, to work hard to become a demigod so as to better protect my father, mother, and brothers. Oh, I've recently visited the applicants to the Bursary Foundation with the other staff of the foundation. Their living conditions are really worse than I imagined. Although I've read some reports and was mentally prepared, I still found it unsettling when I saw it with my own eyes. A girl who's just a few years younger than me was very short and skinny. She doesn't fill her stomach daily, and she only has 2 tattered dresses. When she said that she wishes to study, her eyes were extremely pure and filled with an earnest desire. I can't forget it to this day. As she spoke, Audrey acutely sensed the change in German Sparrow's mental state. It was no longer a completely still lake, and it was now rippling and undulating. After a short deliberation, this psychiatrist continued as though she didn't seem to notice anything. I once anticipated having a beautiful wedding, wishing that my prince will appear like those popular novels. However, after becoming a spectator, I realized that I might never be able to fulfill this dream. I can often read the true thoughts of those men and see through their lies. I'm able to confirm that many people aren't as nice as I imagined, and it has left me disappointed. In a few more years, I might be able to appreciate people for their flaws, but it's really difficult to do so now. Noticing that German Sparrow, who had his back to her across the wall, having the emotions of laughter, Audrey did a timely placate on him. Then, she heard him ask, "You once gathered information about dragons from the sun. You should have some understanding of the dragon of imagination. If I were to tell you that your father, mother, and brothers are imagined by the spectator pathway's king of angels and that they do not really exist, what would be your reaction?" I'll definitely collapse on the spot and directly lose control. Mr. World has a psychological problem because of his discovery that the thing that he has been anticipating, his ultimate goal, will never be fulfilled. Audrey was first alarmed by German Sparrow's question before she realized the essence of the question. She didn't reply as she asked in a guiding manner, "You seem to have witnessed the destruction of hope." There was a self-deprecating scoff sounding from the wall behind Audrey. "Indeed, I once thought that I had family. Later, I realized that it was only an extravagant hope of mine." "Why do you say that?" Audrey asked like she was having a casual chat. German Sparrow fell silent for a few seconds before saying, "Have you heard of those fairy tales that Emperor Roselle used for bringing up children?" "Those are my childhood memories," Audrey acknowledged. At the same time, she discovered that Mr. World's emotions were clearly stirred on the other side of the wall. Repressed pain was surging out. This time, Audrey didn't use placate. Her spiritual intuition and professional knowledge told her that he needed to vent it out. "Then you should know of Sleeping Beauty and her prince," German Sparrow said with a soft, hoarse voice. "There's one such person who also entered a deep sleep until he suddenly woke up one day. He believes that his family is still around, and he works hard to improve himself, hoping that he can one day find them. This becomes his main driving force in life. Finally, he realized that he has slept for at least 300 years, or even more than 1,000 years, perhaps even longer. He can never find anything that he once had anymore." The intense pain and sense of loss was extremely clear to Audrey. She came to a realization. The gloomy, restrained, experienced, and ruthless Mr. World also has his own goals and reason for existing. This is in line with his gentle heart. How pitiful. Although he was giving an example using a fairy tale, some of the emotions he felt when saying certain words reflect reality. When he mentioned deep sleep, family, 300 years, more than 1,000 years, even longer, never find, his pain clearly increased. This means that he's from an ancient time and has lived to this day due to certain encounters? This matches the situation of Mr. Fool being an awakening ancient god. It's no wonder he became his blessed. Audrey quickly grasped the key to the matter. She pursed her lips and pondered for a moment. Did his family say anything? Did they say what they wanted him to do when he wakes up? Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 948. From Audrey's point of view, Mr. World's current situation wasn't him suffering from a mental illness, nor was it close to pushing him to the state of losing control. It was because his goal in life and the meaning to his existence had been destroyed. It left him with a psychological barrier that just needed some guidance. Once she helped him set up a short-term goal, allowing him to find meaning in life, the problem would slowly be resolved. In the serene and silent darkness, Audrey heard German Sparrow answer in a deep voice across the wall, "No." As expected. Audrey wasn't surprised as she asked, "Then did he search for his family's last words? Did he search for their grave? Did he try to figure out the reason for the deep sleep?" The spirit body behind the wall seemed to vanish for a few seconds as there wasn't a single sound. After a moment, the hoarse voice continued. "No, not yet. Not yet. That means that it's a possibility in the future?" Audrey felt relieved as she clearly felt that German Sparrow's emotional state wasn't as heavy and gloomy as before, without any interest in anything. He had a certain level of drive and a tiny sense of urgency. He was just still in a state of confusion. Taking this opportunity, Audrey cast Placate again. The effects were much better than before. At the very least, she believed that Mr. World had used this impetus to escape from the abyss of gloominess and depression, returning to a normal person's disheartened state. Following that, Audrey didn't press on regarding how he could find clues or investigate, because this could bring about some resistance. She nodded in the dark room in a natural manner and said, "Yes, there are many things to do, and many things that need amending. Perhaps you will have the chance of meeting someone from the same bloodline? Perhaps a family member of his hasn't died from age, or had ended up living to this day due to some reason. The reason why there's meaning to life is because of its infinite possibilities. In the process of searching, make sure to not miss out on your surroundings. Life isn't just a one-way street. There are many branches and alleys. If only the former exists, how boring would it be? You should know how to approach it, to broaden your horizons, and to discover." Trying hard to recall all the suitable words she read in books, Audrey suddenly thought of something as her voice softened significantly. "Also, don't wear that thick mask. The thinner and transparent ones don't matter because everyone wears a mask when interacting with others. No one likes to directly express one's relatively private secrets to others. It's both a way to protect oneself and also a way to respect others. When Mr. World has a certain number of friends, a new meaning in life will naturally be formed." Audrey added inwardly, but she ultimately didn't say it out loud. She believed that it might even backfire. Unsurprisingly, German Sparrow fell silent again, seemingly still in confusion. After a few seconds, a voice that wasn't that hoarse sounded again. "Thank you for straightening me out, and for your treatment." "No, this is all a result of the strength inside you," Audrey replied seriously. She cast a final placate to confirm that Mr. World's mental state was back to normal and that it wouldn't relapse. She then heard German Sparrow say, "Let's end it here for today, okay?" Audrey adjusted her tone and briskly replied, "Of course. It's not a serious problem. I can do another follow-up whenever you're free next week. Also, if it's possible, make some medicine to stabilize your mental state. Take it for 7 consecutive days. The ingredients are 10 grams of chamomile powder, 5 grams of rosemary powder, 10 milliliters of lemon balm extract. During this period, don't reduce your consumption of desserts and try to relax yourself in an appropriate manner." In the dark and silent room, she propped herself against the wall with her hands and slowly stood up. At this moment, German Sparrow's voice passed through the wall. "What's the consultation fee?" Audrey held one hand to the wall and turned her head in thought. "Wait till I get the potion formula for sequence 5 of the spectator pathway. I might need you to help me find the ingredients. If the psychology alchemists provides me with the ingredients, She curled the ends of her lips and said, "When you return from the southern continent to Backland, remember to bring me some of the local produce as a gift. A super luxurious and light transportation coffin that's carried by 8 people." On the other side of the wall, Klein had the inexplicable urge to lampoon. He then stood up while clinging to the wall and sent Miss Justice back to the real world. With a wave of his hand, the room vanished. He returned to the seat of honor at the long bronze table and sat at the seat belonging to the fool. In front of him, there were the Black Emperor, Tyrant, and Red Priest cards of blasphemy on the right. On the left, there was the Creeping Hunger, which Leonard Mitchell had sent back via Miss Messenger Rionette Tynker. "I owe Miss Messenger 10,000 gold coins again. Klein retracted his gaze and raised his right hand to rub his temples. To prevent Int Zangwill from escaping through the spirit world, he had already communicated with Rionette Tinker before he made plans for the murder. She was in charge of chasing away all the spirit world creatures around Revival Square, in exchange for that very same 10,000 gold coins. The only thing that caught him by surprise was that 0-08 was more terrifying than he imagined. With Int Zangwill suffering from Deity's curse, and with King of Angels Adam having drained it, its first attempt was able to attract an unknown creature which could pass through Rionette Tinker's seal. If not for Daily Simone's forceful spirit channeling and signing a pact, Int Zangwill might very well have escaped. Of course, while under Deity's curse, even if Int Zangwill were to successfully escape, there was a high chance of him encountering other misfortunes, such as being thrown by the unknown creature to somewhere more dangerous or having it directly cause him harm. However, that wasn't within Klein's control. At the thought that he was 10,000 gold coins in debt again, Klein felt a headache, but his mental state was a lot better. After seeing the cocoon above the grey cloud, and the door of light beyond the staircase of light, he had suffered a shock that was as though a river had broken through its banks. He felt that all his expectations had been shattered. His mature worldview, outlook on life, and values had crumbled as a result, causing his entire being to fall into a turbid state, as though he were a walking zombie. Thankfully, he still had the innate desire to live and had sought out his private psychiatrist, Miss Justice Audrey, in time for treatment. Phew. Klein exhaled and forced himself to turn his thoughts towards the cocoons. And from the scene he saw, his first reaction was, an extremely high-level existence or sealed artifact had used different means to grab a large group of people from Earth at the same moment in time. Here, there were people who used the luck enhancement ritual, others bought strange silver plates, or had their phones hit by some strange virus. Then, these transmigrators had their souls sealed inside the cocoon and were left hanging above the door of light, awaiting a particular opportunity before being sent to the real world. Based on Klein's observation, the door of light didn't have any intelligence. It was operating based on pure instinct. This also meant that as long as the conditions were met, it would catalyze a cocoon and deliver the soul inside to a specific target's body. Based on the current circumstances, Klein guessed that there were probably two conditions that needed to be met. First, there mustn't be any other transmigrators prior, or the transmigrator had already been deemed to have failed or died. Second, the calling out of a certain object, item, or ritual. For instance, Klein Moretti had followed the Antigonus family's notebook to perform that dark divination. As for the rest, it's impossible to know. Unless I can find the corresponding content in Emperor Rozel's diary. Putting together everything that I know, my current theory should be very close to the truth. This will make it easy to explain why, despite being from the same era as the Emperor on Earth, with less than a year in between us, our entry into the real world was separated by slightly more than 200 years. It's because we transmigrated at the same time, but we were released in different eras. Before entering the real world, who knows how long we've been asleep for? A brother from next door? Klein leaned back into his chair as his eyes shimmered before turning gloomy again. This was a hypothesis he came up with based on the conditions of the Door of Light, his situation, and the Emperor's diary. Of course, this didn't mean that there weren't other possibilities. At present, Klein was just unable to find evidence to support them. For example, a cocoon might represent the life of a transmigrator, but this was in contradiction with Klein's own recovery or the lack of change in his spirit body. And if his hypothesis wasn't too different from the truth, it meant that he had left Earth, transmigrating over for at least 200 years or even thousands of years. Even if he found the way and method to go back to Earth, he was unable to return to the place he called home. Compared to the gap in distance, the barrier of time left him in greater despair. This novelbin.com for new updates. This was the reason why it caused Klein's mental state to instantly collapse. Returning home was always his ultimate goal. Miss Justice is right. There are still many questions to resolve and to probe. What's the meaning behind hanging so many transmigrators behind the Door of Light? What goal does it have? Who set up everything back then? How many people were pulled in here? Where has the other person gone to? The celestial worthy of heaven and earth? Klein tried hard to engross himself in thinking so as to find a new goal for the future. Unfortunately, he was only able to approach the door of light and not touch it. He was unable to touch it, grasp it, or even carefully inspect it. He had no means to do any studies to receive any direct information. I should consider finding clues from the real world. Also, since reaching sequence 4 allows me to reach that grey cloud and see the door of light, will there be another qualitative change at sequence 2? Will I be able to gain control over the door of light when that happens, allowing me to figure out the truth? I was affected by the 7 lights, the goddess, and Rhodes's attitude. I almost imagined myself to be the real owner of the grey fog, and believe that I'm some great master above the spirit world. Now, from the looks of it, I'm just a test subject that was randomly thrown down. Once I fail, the next transmigrator will appear. Klein thought as he tapped the edge of the long bronze table. He was rather curious of another point. 3 broken cocoons, with one representing himself, and another representing the Emperor, so who was the third one? Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 949. Klein's first target of suspicion was undoubtedly Elf King Sennacherib. This ancient god had created chopsticks, made blood cakes, enjoyed eating animal innards, and was good at using spices for cooking. His descendants had facial features, hair color, and eyes that resembled Asians on Earth. Not only did Klein suspect that he was a transmigrator, even Emperor Roselle shared his feelings. Of course, after a deeper level of investigations, Roselle had ruled out that hypothesis from their language, symbols, traditional proverbs, and other facets. Klein believed that using chopsticks as cutlery, the preference for eating innards, and using spices wasn't an exclusive trait. To a species that enjoyed nature, it was possible for these to gradually appear in their daily life. F0 Low New Chapters at november/el/bin/.com. As for why elves who wielded the sailor pathway were close to nature, Klein didn't know why. It was just something as described by the murals and texts they left behind. I for one felt that the Elf King is unlikely to be a transmigrator, but after seeing the 3 shattered cocoons, I can't be too sure. Perhaps he might be a fellow countryman. I can't rule out the possibility that this ancient god isn't a transmigrator, but that one of the high-ranking elves around him is one. This can also allow the tradition to pass down in the name of the Elf King. Klein tapped his fingers as he thought silently. Almost at the same time, he had 2 directions for his investigation. Grozelle's travels had elvish songster, Syatas, who served Sennacherib's queen of Calamity Kohainam. As long as I enter her sea of collective subconscious, I should be able to see or make contact with the elves and find memory fragments regarding the ancient god. I can also use hypnosis, directly allowing her subconscious to speak. But the problem is that I'm not good at such matters. The last time I attempted to delve into Grozelle's subconscious, I felt quick-tempered and could hardly calm down. Although I'm already a demigod, it also becomes more pressing that I resist the inclination towards madness and losing control. And I won't be able to regulate my mental state for quite some time. Forcefully spirit channeling isn't suitable for such a situation and for such a target. Klein frowned slightly. He felt that he might need a mystical item that was of a relatively high-level sequence in the spectator pathway, or an assistant that was at least a hypnotist. He began seriously considering the possibility of getting Miss Justice's help. There's no problem doing it. It's not impossible to leave by entering as a spirit body above the grey fog. I don't have to worry that Miss Justice will pry into the secret of a transmigrator. As long as Syatas doesn't have any knowledge of this, her subconscious and collective subconscious wouldn't point towards such a conclusion. And I can find the desired clues in details so they don't pay any notice. The biggest problem is that Miss Justice has no adventuring experience and she lacks it. Entering the sea of subconscious of an ancient figure is very dangerous to her. There might be the remnants of an ancient god in there at any time. Once I don't have the help of a psychiatrist, I will also end up the same. Even if I'm getting Miss Justice's support, I'll have to wait until she reaches sequence 5 so that she can use her level to make up for her lack of experience. When that happens, we can first attempt to hypnotize Syatas and see what we can learn from her mouth. If there's nothing of value, we can consider entering her dream to delve deeper into her consciousness and step into that sea. Yes, the dream charms I create now aren't potent enough. I might not be able to maintain such a long exploration. Psy, the goddess, won't directly respond to such trivial matters. It's a fixed feedback based on a fixed ritual. The corresponding beyonder characteristics have been returned to the church. Don't tell me that I need to bring Leonard with me. I wonder if pulling someone at the spirit body level can avoid the notice of the grandpa inside him. I'll do some research over the next few days. Klein reined in his thoughts and considered his second target of suspicion. This person didn't seem too special in the past, nor did Klein believe that he was a transmigrator. But now that his mind calmed down, he began processing his thoughts and analyzing. Klein realized that many points that he viewed as common sense weren't that simple on careful thought. They contained an unspeakable sense of horror. He suspected the ancient sun god, the city of Silver's creator. The 7 churches' separate Bibles have similarities to Earth's Western religions. It is similarly the case for their masses. Based on Little Sun's description, from what Emperor Razel saw from Adam's chapel, and the content of the murals in the Forsaken Land of the Gods, it's clear that the ancient sun god's main symbol is the cross. He gave his children the names Adam and Amorn. The angels beneath him all have wings of light. I've not seen that in the other pathways to date. It's unknown how he rose up. He suddenly appeared late in the Second Epoch, killed several ancient gods, and took their various authorities. I never thought much about these details in the past. It's quite scary now that I think deeply of it. Klein drew a gasp as he began feeling more convinced that it was the ancient sun god instead of Elf King Sennayathrim. His experiences were just too legendary, more of a protagonist of an era than Emperor Razel. Of course, his outcome was rather tragic, becoming a feast for his kings of angels. Emperor Razel was also tragic, but in no way as terrible. Doesn't this imply Amorn's and Adam's attitude in a certain sense? They believe that the grey fog is related to their father, but due to their different pathways, they made different choices. There's a certain chance that Adam can't see the grey fog. He isn't a high sequence beyonder of the Fate, Marauder, Seer, and Apprentice pathways. Klein nodded slightly. Based on these clues, he also had a direction of investigation that didn't require him to make contact with major figures at the angel level. In Grozel's travels lived ascetic snowman who survived the Third Epoch and had served the ancient sun god. The problem circles back to itself. There's nothing to doubt about the rest for the time being. Klein slowly exhaled, reached out his right hand, and picked up the newly obtained card of blasphemy, Red Priest card. Infusing his spirituality into it, the card produced a blood-red light, forming a palm-sized illusory book. The pages of the book flipped, presenting portraits of a lifelike Razel Gustov. He was either wearing a hunter's attire, raising his middle finger, walking through a burning building, or standing behind a trap. He had all sorts of attires and was doing all kinds of things. Sequence 9, Hunter. Sequence 8, Provoker. Sequence 7, Pyromaniac. Sequence 6, Conspirer. Sequence 5, Reaper. Sequence 4, Iron-Blooded Knight. Sequence 3, War Bishop. Sequence 2, Weather Warlock. Sequence 1, Conqueror. Sequence 0, Red Priest. Klein's gaze swept past the different portraits on the tarot card and imprinted the content into his mind. He wasn't surprised that this pathway sequence owes ritual to become a god. This was because Hermes had once told Razel that the red in Red Priest meant the red of war. Therefore, when he saw stirring up a war that sweeps an entire continent and gain victory, he wasn't stirred at all. After flipping the Red Priest card, he began thinking about problems and felt his mental state improve. He rubbed his temples, finally feeling exhausted. I should set a short-term goal and investigate the person behind the Great Smog of Backland. This is something that I've yet to complete. Yes, I should continue the arms deal according to my original plans and return to Backland after receiving the money. Now, there are 2 clues. First, the captain of the Royal Guards, Viscount Stratford, and the other is MI9's Deputy Director, Brigadier General Konas Kilger. Klein tried to pull himself up and decided to occupy himself with something. Before leaving the grey fog, he threw the mental medicine recipe that Miss Justice had given him to the Crimson Star representing the Moon Emlyn. He requested this vampire, who was good at making it, to make a week's worth at £1 a bottle. Backlund, within the Odora family's villa. Emlyn White, who was waiting in the activity room, curled his lips and thought to himself, a transaction that's just £7. I really don't want to do it. The world can concoct it himself if he's a little careful. He hadn't objected to the world's request, because after spending £5,000 to buy the Sequence 5 Vampire Beyond a Characteristic, he only had £730 left. At this moment, Cosme walked over, looking like a middle-aged gentleman. After exchanging a bow, the sanguine Baron asked, "Emlyn, why are you suddenly here?" Emlyn immediately felt a little guilty before recalling his previous experiences of conversing with the Hanged Man and the world. He tipped his chin slightly and answered in a seemingly casual manner, "I've received a Sequence 5 Scarlet Scholar Beyond a Characteristic. I wonder when we can begin the ritual to make me a Viscount." Cosme was taken aback as he asked in surprise, "You obtained a Scarlet Scholar Beyond a Characteristic?" Emlyn glanced at him and nodded with a faint smile. "That's right." He didn't explain how he had obtained the Beyond a Characteristic, as though Cosme wasn't worthy of knowing. Cosme turned agape as he fell silent. After a few seconds, he said, "Wait till the next full moon." He paused and said, "I happen to have something for you. My grandfather wishes to inform you that an important figure will be coming to Backlund. He wishes to meet you." "Me?" Emlyn's pupils dilated instantly. The ancient ones of the Sanguine that lived since the Second Epoch to this day, together with the Grado sealed artifacts, all of those important existences at the angel level didn't exceed 5 in number. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 950. Emlyn fell silent for 2 seconds as he lowered his chin and asked, "Who is it?" To him, angels were naturally worthy of respect, but those who could truly make him bow his head were the important figures addressed as he by every Sanguine. They had witnessed and experienced the Sanguine's long history, the source of his pride. "I'm not sure. But in short, I'll notify you when the time comes." Cosme Odora shook his head. "The person is coming because of the ancestor's revelation? There are subsequent instructions? Why doesn't the ancestor directly give me a revelation? This will be better concealed. I'm her chosen one. This is to avoid agitating Mr. Fool?" Questions flashed past Emlyn's mind as he answered them himself. He didn't speak further as he wore his top hat and left Odora's villa. When he arrived at the door, he looked at the thin clouds that could hardly block out the sun. Emlyn curled his lips in disdain, raised his hand to press down on his hat, and ran for a rental carriage at the end of the street as he inwardly mumbled, "Such weather really isn't suitable for heading out. The medicine that the world wants isn't rare. It can be concocted in 15 minutes. The ingredients I ordered previously should be in by today. I can carry out the transaction with Miss Magician that I've delayed for days. Backlund, Sherwood Borough." Force placed glass bottles on an altar and looked at the light blue and golden liquids, feeling the exhilaration from shopping. More enticing than a cocktail. I wonder what it tastes like. Putting some ice in might make it taste better. Seriously, what am I thinking? These are all medicine. Force sputtered at herself and hurriedly cleaned up the room. Upon receiving the medicine required for medical treatment, she finished her preparations for heading to the abandoned castle in Delaire Forest. She was just waiting for Zio to return. After tidying up certain matters, Force slumped onto the sofa and casually picked up a few newspaper copies and began planning her itinerary for the day. Set off at dusk. Dinner will probably be when we arrive at the town bordering the forest. Amidst her silent mumbling, Force flipped to the copy of News at Sea. Suddenly, her gaze froze as a familiar name was reflected in her eyes, German Sparrow. This adventurer had appeared at sea again, boarding the Black Tulip with a middle-aged name known as Death Consul. He killed Admiral Hell Ludwell, changing the lineup of the 7 pirate admirals again. Ill. Force subconsciously patted her chest, unsure what she was happy about. At that instant, she had a baffling feeling that German Sparrow's experiences were sufficiently legendary, something that could definitely be written into a novel. Unfortunately, he's not someone who's easy to get along with, otherwise, I can totally be a part-time biographer to write a book for him. Ha ha, if I were to write the book titled German Sparrow, I'll definitely be targeted by the official Beyonders. Force thought in amusement before hearing the lock turn. She looked up and saw Zio pushing open the door and entering the living room. You early? Force asked in surprise. Zio ruffled the right side of her blonde hair and said, I met with MI9 again and received a mission. What is it? Force sat up, asking out of curiosity. Zio casually threw herself onto the single-seater. Investigate the background of the crazy adventurer, German Sparrow. Based on the information provided by MI9, he's a terrifying Beyonder, and the name he uses is fake. Even his identification documents are fake. He probably came from Backland. They suspect that German Sparrow has another identity and partners here. Upon hearing the word partners, Force couldn't help but twitch the corners of her mouth. She had the urge to tell Zio that MI9's guess was right. German Sparrow's partner was sitting directly opposite her. She coughed slightly and acted calm while she asked, why are you investigating German Sparrow's background? What did he do this time? Zio glanced at the stack of newspapers beside Force. Haven't you read today's news at sea? German Sparrow killed Admiral Hell Ludwell and is now known as the strongest adventurer of the 5 seas. By the way, MI9 also told me that German Sparrow might very well believe in the secret existence known as the Fall. This is news that came from many different sources, including the Aurora Order and the Rose School of Thought. I can testify to that. They are right. Force forced a smile and said, sounds rather dangerous. Yeah. Zio nodded. I only plan on gathering the intel and not delving too deep into it. Force didn't continue on this topic as she said, I've already prepared the medicine. Shall we head to Delaire Forest today? Zio had already become a Sequence 7 interrogator a few days ago, and she had mastered a rather useful power, psychic piercing. All right. Zio stood up, showcasing how she was a woman of action. Let's set off now. Ah? Let's wait a little longer. I was thinking dusk. Force replied, feeling a little resistant. She often wished to procrastinate until the last moment. Before long, she was pulled out of their rented apartment by Zio while bringing all kinds of items along. They got a rental carriage and headed for the metro. Amidst the sonorous whistle of the steam engine, the massive steam locomotive hauled its meandering body and entered the platform. Under the illumination of the wall lamps on both sides, it stopped. Force and Zio stood outside a carriage and waited patiently for the passengers to alight. Suddenly, they saw 2 red gloves. The owner of the red gloves was a man in his 30s. He wore a white shirt with a black trench coat. His collar was raised up high, covering his chin and mouth. He had a pair of dark green eyes with golden brown sideburns. He held a silver chest that was big enough to put a tiny violin in it. Force and Zio exchanged looks as they lowered their gaze, staring at their toes. As a high-ranking deacon of the Church of Evanites Nighthawks, one of the 22 members of power in the church, and one of the 3 bigwigs of the Red Gloves, Crestit Sesamir wasn't someone who cared about parading himself around. He enjoyed traveling alone, taking the transportation that commoners took, making him appear like an ordinary clergyman. After transferring to another line, he eventually arrived in Northborough. He then took a rental carriage and headed straight for St. Samuel Cathedral, where he met Backland Diocese's Archbishop, St. Anthony Stevenson. After greeting each other and praising the goddess, Sesamir found a seat and said, I'll be troubling you to provide me with some help for the next couple weeks. The clean-shaved Archbishop, Anthony, in his black robe with red accent sat down as well. He deliberated before asking, is it something to do with Sangwil? Yes. Sesamir nodded slightly. The Holy See wishes that I inform you that another servant of the goddess, the matron of the Evernite cloister, Moriona, will be in Backland not long from now. This ascetic was ranked first among all the 13 archbishops. Without waiting for St. Anthony's inquiry, he explained in detail. Milia learned plenty of important information from Int Zangwil's remnant spirit, including his mental problems that 0-08 used to escape, as well as the details of his cooperation with the royal family and the Demonist sect. After machinating the Great Smog of Backland, Int Zangwil was betrayed by 0-08 and had ended up being possessed by the Red Angel evil spirit. He headed for the southern continent alone in an attempt to set up a trap to hunt Milia. An important point to take note of is that in Int Zangwil's memories there is a very important underground ruin. It's in the northwestern outskirts of Backland, an area just before the Tussock River flows in. My mission is to find that ruin. St. Anthony finished listening in silence before asking in thought. Int Zangwil doesn't know of the exact location. He has never been there before? Sesamir shook his head. He had entered, but he was led in there and didn't grasp the required key information. St. Anthony tersely acknowledged before asking, have you figured out which batch of people from the royal family that Int Zangwil was working with? No. Crested Sesamir paused and continued, based on normal logic, regardless of whether the partners don disguises, if they meet, there should be the corresponding memory fragments, but inside Int Zangwil's spirit body, there were no traces of that. It was as though it never existed. Perhaps it's an influence of a deed. The source of the deed's power that even a sequence for demigod can't resist is something worth paying attention to. St. Anthony nodded very slightly. He thought and said, the telegram didn't include much. I do not know the exact sequence of events. Who exactly killed Int Zangwil? Crested Sesamir exhaled slowly and said, a name you might never believe, Klein Moretti. The Nighthawk who died in the line of duty during the Tingen incident. Anthony's wrinkles deepened. Yes, that's what Ilya sent back. No one knows how Klein Moretti, who was only a sequence 8, had resurrected, or how he could kill Int Zangwil, a demigod wielding 0-08. Upon saying this, Sesamir's expression turned somewhat odd. The Holy See requests us to strictly keep this intel confidential. We are not to divulge this to anyone who isn't an archbishop or high-ranking deacon. Furthermore, we are not to pursue Klein Moretti, pretending as though he's still in his grave. St. Anthony fell silent for a few seconds as though he recalled something trivial. He nodded and said, perhaps, he's a blessed of the goddess. Sesamir suddenly looked up at St. Anthony as though he was a lunatic. His lips quivered, but he ultimately didn't say a word. Anthony didn't continue the topic as he looked at the door and said sternly, your mission might need plenty of investigations. This requires enough manpower. Soist's team has completed their mission in the southern continent. I'll get them to return quickly and follow your instructions. This novelbin.com for new updates. All right. Crested Sesamir didn't put up any objections. Rest for the remainder of the day before returning to Backland? Leonard looked up at team captain, Soist. Soist looked pitifully at Leonard, who had been silent for quite some time, and nodded. That's right. After watching this spirit warlock leave his room, Leonard sighed and leaned against the wall. At this moment, dark red light surged out from before his eyes, enveloping him completely without any prior warning. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 951. By the time Leonard reacted, he saw numerous towering stone pillars, as well as a towering palace that looked like a giant's residence above the endless greyish-white fog that was being propped up by these stone pillars. His green eyes wore a blank look. After a second, Leonard found himself sitting on a high-backed chair beside a long-mottled bronze table at some point in time. Beside him and opposite him were high-backed chairs that exuded solemnity. Rare latest chapters on no/v/e/l/b-in.com. And at the end of the long mottled table, where the seat of honor was, a figure was shrouded in thick grey fog. The figure was leaning into his seat leisurely, as though he was overlooking everything. When this figure appeared in Leonard's eyes, he felt as though he was on a liner, seeing a bottomless abyss whose boundaries were nowhere to be seen. It also felt like he had left the city and was on the outskirts, looking up to see lofty mountains that tore through the clouds. Instantly, many thoughts flashed through Leonard's mind. He had a rough guess as to what he was experiencing. As a beyonder of the church, a believer who knew that deities truly exist, he wasn't able to resist his feelings. He subconsciously wished to leave his seat and prostrate before the existence before him. The might of a deity was boundless. Just as Leonard stood up, he was pressed down by an invisible force. A slow and calm voice resonated in his ears. "There's no need for such trouble. You can call me Mr. Fool." The Fool? Indeed. Leonard's fear of the unknown had settled immediately. Although he was still worried about what would happen next, he wasn't that perturbed any longer. He didn't sit uneasily with a dry mouth and parched lips. He got up halfway, pressed his hand to his chest, and bowed. "Honorable Mr. Fool, why did you summon me here?" As an experienced Nighthawk and a Red Glove who had participated in major cases, Leonard knew how dangerous it was to establish a connection with a secret existence. He knew that he had slid down the edge of the abyss and had no chance of redemption. At that moment when he decided to chant the Fool's honorific name, he was able to foresee his tragic end. But for revenge, he had made the choice regardless. However, everyone had the instinct to survive. Recalling how Klein Moretti, who believed in the Fool, was still alive and had even become a demigod, Leonard couldn't help but hold out some hope and expectations. At this moment, he heard the fog-enshrouded Fool chuckle. "Since you prayed to me for help, then based on the principle of equivalent exchange, you definitely need to pay the price." Leonard's body trembled as he bowed his head lower. "What is it you wish?" After a brief pause, the Fool's voice sounded again. "There's no rush. Perhaps there will be something that requires you to provide help to certain people. Have a seat." Leonard slowly calmed himself down and sat down. He looked around and asked, Klein Moretti has been here like me?" The Fool said with a calm tone, in a different manner. Different manner? Indeed, Klein didn't enter because he chanted the honorific name. He had been introduced by that death consul named Azigegas before becoming one of Mr. Fool's faithful. Leonard couldn't help but survey the area, and he discovered that there were a total of 22 high-back chairs around the long wattle table. It corresponds to the 22 beyonder pathways. There are also 22 tarot cards. The Fool. Just as Leonard came up with a theory, he heard Mr. Fool chuckle. "Other than you, there are other living beings that have been pulled in here for various reasons. They earnestly wished for me to convene a gathering to carry out the exchange of information and the transaction of materials and formulas. They also help each other. This allows them to rapidly advance, eventually becoming high-sequence beyonders. This is a little different from the secret organization represented by tarot cards I had imagined. It's rather loosely organized. What motives does Mr. Fool have to agree to such a request?" After coming to the ancient palace above the grey fog, Leonard felt high-strung, causing his thought processes to be a lot more agile than usual. He came up with all kinds of questions. After successfully achieving revenge, he had been feeling low-spirited and empty for a moment, as though he had lost his goal in life. However, he quickly pulled himself together. This was because Daly's death told him that he wasn't strong enough. To reduce the number of casualties of his companions in future missions, and so as to not lack the ability to save them, he needed to reach sequence 4 at the very least. He needed to become a demigod. Therefore, the Fool's words had stirred his heart. He felt that it was an opportunity. Meanwhile, he also believed that by joining the gathering, he could deeply understand the situation of the secret organization. It helped in maximally averting the danger that resulted from establishing contact with the Fool. After some deliberation, Leonard asked, "Klein Moretti is also a regular member of this gathering? Does he have a seat here?" The Fool replied without much concern, "Yes." Leonard fell silent for a second as he asked, "Honorable Mr. Fool, can I join this regular gathering?" Shrouded in the grey fog, the Fool said with a smile, "Sure. But when you return, remember to mention this to Palace Zoroast about it. Do not attempt to hide it from him." "Him? Old man really is an angel. It's no wonder the luck siphon charm is so magical. Although Leonard had already expected this, he still couldn't help but be alarmed after receiving confirmation from Mr. Fool. He hesitated for a moment and said, "Why must I tell Palace Zoroast?" Although he had a good relationship with Palace Zoroast and had established a certain level of trust, he still felt wary. The reason why he had made the request to join Mr. Fool's secret gathering was to balance the latent danger of the ancient parasite. He then heard Mr. Fool reply with a smile, "Many a time, striking fear is a lot more useful than conflict." Striking fear is a lot more useful than conflict. That's right, forcefully creating a balance might agitate old man regardless, the final battlefield will be in my body, and it would be extremely disadvantageous to me. By striking fear into him, I can get him to recognize the situation. Even if he has ill intent, he will think of another solution and take another path. Leonard bowed his head in enlightenment. "Honorable Mr. Fool, I have no more questions." At the end of the long bronze table, the Fool conjured a deck of tarot cards and lifted up his hand and pointed at them. They have each selected a tarot card to represent their code name. You can also choose one. The deck has the cards of their respective owners taken away. They do use tarot cards as their code names. Leonard exhaled and couldn't help but ask again, "Which card is Klein Moretti?" "The world," the Fool said casually. "It's him, and also not him." "What does that mean?" Leonard didn't dare to ask further. He extended his right hand and pulled out a card from the deck of tarot cards. Flipping it over, he saw a goddess pouring holy water, with stars littering the background. The star card. This didn't match Leonard's taste, but since he had already completed the ritual under Mr. Fool's watch, he could only accept it. Return. The gathering happens every Monday at 3 in the afternoon, Backlund time. Shrouded in the grey fog, the Fool raised his hand and made Leonard, who was rushing to bow, vanish from the ancient palace. The Fool Klein chuckled as he flipped all the tarot cards. All of them had the same picture with the same sky-filled stars. All of them were the star cards. After laughing for a while, Klein cast his gaze to the crimson star that represented Leonard. While attempting to pull the poet above the grey fog, he had made some careful observation and had discovered that there was a blob of light hiding in Leonard Mitchell's body. It seemed to be made of countless ringed worms, hidden deep inside his soul body. This made Klein confirm that Palace Zoroast had only parasitized Leonard at a preliminary stage. He didn't control Leonard's body of heart and mind, astral projection, ether body, and physical body. And after advancing to become a demigod, Klein had gained a deeper control over the mysterious space above the grey fog, allowing him to pull in anyone he wanted, without targeting the soul. He could make a selection. Therefore, Klein decided to not touch Leonard's soul body, and only pulled his astral projection above the grey fog. This avoided agitating Palace Zoroast or end up bringing him into the mysterious space. Of course, it was almost certain that the Sequence 1 angel of the Marauder pathway would notice it. And the ability to enter the dreams of others stemmed from the astral projection of Beyondus of the Evernight pathway, so it didn't affect Leonard's ability to do what he was good at in this mysterious space. Let's hope that he can escape from Palace Zoroast's parasitizing bit by bit. Klein suddenly sighed. The reason why he made Leonard join the Tarot Club was because he wished to help this former teammate grow stronger, allowing him to escape the claws of Palace Zoroast. If that Marauder pathway angel didn't have any ill intent, he could get Leonard to help him hide from Amorn and aid his recovery. This would speed up his switching of parasitic targets. Retracting in his gaze, Klein thought for a moment. He threw the Hunter Pathway Sequence 6 Conspira Potion formula to the point of light representing Danitz. He then instructed him to leave the southern continent and return to the Golden Dream. Black Hunting Spider's Composite Eye, Sphinx's Brain. Danitz recalled the content he had just seen in a daze as he stood up in delight. He planned to immediately bid farewell to Anderson and leave the dangerous southern continent. After coming to the door of the Fog Sea's strongest hunter, he knocked on the wooden door, only to see it open. Anderson hadn't locked the door. Danitz was puzzled as he cast his gaze inside and saw Anderson holding a knife and sliding it against his abdomen. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 952. Danitz jumped in fright as he blurted out, "Sorry, I didn't see anything." Before he could finish his sentence, he had already pulled the door handle towards him. Bang! The door closed, emitting a sound that echoed through the corridor. At this point, Danitz finally came to a realization. What was I doing just now? What is Anderson doing? He instinctively removed the black boxing glove and thought bitterly with a frown. Finally, he decided to return to his room, pack his luggage, and leave. As for what Anderson was trying to do, he felt that something was amiss despite his curiosity. He had no plans on getting himself involved in it, lest he fell into a trap. Captain said that I should maintain fear and respect towards the unknown. So, I should distance myself from this. Just as Danitz turned around, he suddenly heard the door unlock before being opened. Anderson, whose buttons on the lower part of his shirt weren't buttoned up, walked out with a dull, pitch-black knife. He looked at Danitz with a mixed expression. "Aren't you going to try to stop me?" Danitz acutely noticed the chance to mock him as he sniggered. "That's your freedom. If you didn't leave a will, I'll be rich." Anderson rubbed his cheeks. "Aren't you curious about what I encountered?" Danitz glanced at him suspiciously. "I keep feeling as though you're up to something." Anderson roared with laughter. Rare latest chapters on no/v/e/l/b-in.com. Well, I had been captured some time ago and was soaked in strange blood with all kinds of ingredients. I was corroded by it for an extended period of time until a strange chrysalis was formed inside my body. This was to create the effect of having a certain level of attraction towards high sequence beyond us of the hunter pathway. As he spoke, he pointed at his abdomen. Danitz was taken aback. "I've never really heard of something like that. If you were another sex, I might have imagined that you're pregnant." He paused for a moment before asking, "That strange fellow in Revival Square was attracted by the baby, no chrysalis in your stomach?" Anderson nodded as Danitz gestured with his hands. "You were trying to cut open your abdomen to extract the chrysalis?" Anderson replied honestly, "Yes, I'm worried about how it would affect me, or if it will continue attracting demigods. I have to make every second count to remove this latent problem." Danitz thought before asking in puzzlement, "Then why aren't you making the attempt? You forgot to set up a will, and you want me to be your witness?" Anderson's facial muscles twitched as he chuckled. "Not bad. Your provoker potion should almost be digested." He then sighed. "After some careful analysis, I believe there's no direct way to extract it. Otherwise, they wouldn't have soaked me in blood and allowed the ingredients to seep into me. They could have just opened up my stomach and placed the chrysalis inside before sewing me up." Without waiting for Danitz's reply, he said in thought, "Don't you have the method to contact German Sparrow? He's been through so much and knows so much, so I would like to consult him on how to resolve this problem." In recent months, Danitz was extremely afraid of people raising the matter about him knowing German Sparrow, so he subconsciously retorted, "No. I haven't seen him since I left the Golden Dream." Anderson curled the corner of his lips and said, "When you were writing to German Sparrow, I was beside him and have met his messenger." Danitz's expression immediately froze. He forced a smile after a few seconds. "Then why don't you directly summon his messenger?" Anderson raised his hand again and touched his throat, chuckling. "I don't know the ritual for summoning his messenger." Danitz still suspected that Anderson was up to something, and was unwilling to confirm that he had been repeatedly communicating with German Sparrow. He then suggested, "Actually, you can always seek the help of our captain on such matters. She's very knowledgeable and good at research. She knows many secret techniques and can also seek the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom for help. She should be able to give you the solution for resolving the matter of the chrysalis in your stomach. Ha ha, if you're embarrassed, I can talk to her for you." Just as he said that, he saw Anderson's face beam. He quickly replied with a rushed tone, "All right, let's do that. I've already packed my luggage. When shall we set off?" Danitz fell into a daze for a few seconds, feeling that he had been tricked by Anderson. he returned to the room, drank his remaining beer, and threw all the miscellaneous items into his luggage bag, leaving behind a dried leaf with golden patterns. This was the token Danitz previously used to establish contact with the northern state's dominant leader, General May Sanchez. Following German Sparrow's instructions, he left the leaf inside and allowed the person in charge to follow up. In the room that Danitz checked out of, a candle was suddenly lit as a 2-meter-tall scarlet flame burgeoned. Amidst the flames, a figure walked out. He was wearing a silk top hat, black formal suit, and had white sideburns. He looked outstanding with his deep, blue eyes and mature demeanor. He was none other than Klein as Dwayne Dantes. After picking up the leaf with golden patterns, Klein left the hotel, circling around the sealed-off Revival Square, and came to Kakawa's core region, White Feather Square. May Sanchez's residence was there, located beside a death cathedral that descended downwards. As a standard Lonese gentleman, Dantes looked out of place when walking through the city. Here, the foreigners were a minority, with most foreigners seen around the few major embassies located around Rejoice Square. The other places were filled with mostly locals from Balam. Their skin was slightly brown, and they had curly black hair. Their facial features were soft, and in the eyes of most people from the northern continent, people of the same sex all looked the same, aside from the differences in height and weight. These locals, be it male or female, enjoyed rolling dried tobacco leaves into Balam cigarettes. Along the way, Klein would see residents spewing out smoke alongside the road from time to time. In addition, many of them hung a fruit known as dalua by their waists. This fruit was the size of 2 fists, with thick skin. After digging open a tiny hole and eating the flesh inside, one could use it to store water, alcohol, and other beverages. Based on Klein's observations, they mostly drank an orange-yellow guedar. It was sour with a hint of sweetness, good at quenching thirst and relieving heat. It was also great at keeping people awake. I didn't have a chance to try it before. Klein mumbled as he found the guard manning the general's residence and sought to meet a man named Haggis. Due to his appearance as a Lonese person and a gentleman, the guard didn't deny his request or make it difficult for him. He got a person to head in to get a man in his 30s. The man's facial features and skin were that of a standard Balam native. However, his curly black hair had been pulled straight and neatly combed back as though he was trying to mimic members of high society in the various countries of the northern continent. He wore a white shirt and a black vest, matched with a very formal bow tie. Upon seeing Dwayne Dantes, he said in standard Lonese, "Good afternoon, I'm Haggis. Nice to meet you." His accent was a little odd, different from any borough in London. Klein had lived in high society for quite a period of time, so he wasn't too surprised. He said with a smile, "Good afternoon, I'm Dwayne Dantes. I never expected to meet a gentleman who's so good at using the accent of Lonese nobles." Haggis couldn't help but smile. Many children of noble birth from Lund have come to East and West Balam to seek out opportunities. I was fortunate to learn from them. Oh, I might know some of them. Klein wasn't in a rush to talk business as he began making small talk with Haggis like a gentleman. Haggis smiled. "My friend includes Colonel Alfred Hall, the second son of an earl." "Hall?" Klein let out a soft chuckle. "I once met Earl Hall at a charity party. He's a true noble. What a small world." Haggis nodded in agreement. Perhaps this is an arrangement of fate. Unfortunately, Alfred was transferred to East Balam last year. He didn't continue as he immediately invited Dwayne Dantes into the general's residence. When passing through the side door, Klein suddenly looked up, glancing at the embedded stained glass above. The glass shimmered like a rainbow under the illumination of sunlight, as though gazes were sweeping past. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 953. Klein retracted his gaze in a natural manner, held his gold-inlaid cane, and followed closely behind Haggis before entering the general's residence. The architecture style was completely unlike those found in the southern continent. It didn't make any use of light manipulation to make the rooms appear dark and gloomy, nor did they boldly use some human bones as accessories to produce a strong visual impact. Instead, it was more in the style of the northern continent. Furthermore, there was an undeniable hint of Inti's influence. Every column was covered in segmented gold foil. The use of colors in the murals were warm, and there were sculptures embedded with gold. A beautiful spiral staircase descended from above, connecting all 4 stories before ending in the middle of the huge hall where it faced the entrance. It was extremely grand. I have to say that countries led by the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun are really at the forefront when it comes to gold artwork. It doesn't have the feeling of the gaudy nouveau riche. Klein swept his gaze to the palm-sized golden angels that extended out from the staircase's railings and mid-sections of the columns, holding back his urge to caress them. Looking at the guard standing by the 2 sides, he casually found the topic and said to Haggis, "Colonel Alfred Hall seems to have made some significant contributions in West Balam?" Haggis nodded and used a Lonese noble accent to say, "He's a determined and brave man. He once led a special forces team of more than 30 men to raid an Inti's battalion with more than 1,000 people, completely crippling them. I heard that he had also made significant contributions in East Balam, therefore, becoming a colonel before the age of 30. Sounds impressive. Perhaps Miss Justice's brother has already become a Beyonder with quite a significantly high sequence. In every aristocratic family, every generation should have some members taking the Beyonder path. If this Mr. Alfred finally reaches his goal of becoming a Beyonder with a relatively high sequence and gaining the rank of Brigadier General or Major General through hardship, I wonder how sad would he be when he returns to Backland to realize that he's no match for his sister's dog." Having drank his medicine before heading out today, Klein used the act of lampooning to adjust his mental state. He didn't ask further about Alfred as he asked with a curious tone, "I realize that there are some differences in the traditions of East and West Balam. Here, in many houses, there are people with human bone decorations, but it's not present in East Balam. I've been here several times, but I've never been able to bring myself to get the answer to this question." Haggis stopped and pointed to the exaggerated spiral staircase. "Mr. Dantes, the general will be here in a few minutes." After informing him of this, he chuckled. It's actually not common to see human bone traditions. Only feasts that came under the royal family of the Balam Empire still have this tradition. To us, the death of family members doesn't mean that our relationship has come to an end. After the burial, we will take a piece of their bones and place it at home as a decoration, as a way to indicate that the deceased continue being with the living. As for which bone to choose, it will be decided by the interring priest through a ritual. The best and most symbolic part is the skull. Some families will even make the skull into a vessel for drinking alcohol, using it only when entertaining the most honored guests. "Mr. Dantes, if you close a deal this time, I wish to invite you home. I wish to offer finest wine in my grandfather's skull to show my respects to you." 2:11. Klein's expression nearly fell apart. He felt that he was incapable of accepting the local customs in this aspect. He laughed and was just about to be perfunctory where he saw a figure slowly walking down the golden railings of the staircase. The person didn't wear a hat. He was wearing a cut black military attire with shimmering gold buttons. The sash he wore was red like blood. He had light brown skin and a rather soft facial outline. His facial features looked scrunched up in the middle of his head, making his face appear abnormally big. Klein, who had obtained the relevant information from various channels, instantly recognized the man to be the dominant ruler of West Balam's northern state. He was May Sanchez, who declared himself as general. On the surface, he wavered between the factions of Lun, Intis, Fainapota, Faysak, and the resistance, maintaining a balance, but secretly, he had received the support of the Numinous Episcopate's royal family faction. Meanwhile, Klein suspected that this native general had established a solid working relationship with the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. As for May Sanchez's strength, be it Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina or Admiral of Stars Catlear, he was noted to be a sequence 5. But the two ladies didn't mention which pathway he was from, as the powers this local general exhibited were mostly related to spirits, but he carried a mystical item from the death pathway. "Good afternoon, Your Excellency." Klein took off his hat, pressed his hand to his chest, and bowed. At this moment, he sensed gazes locking onto him from some unknown location. They were like lights that flashed across the golden angel figures, the sunlight reflected from the stained glass or the lustrous glow from the smooth marble. "Hello there, Mr. Dantes," May Sanchez replied in Jutanese. Having grasped Jutanese through his marionette, Klein naturally was able to understand him. However, in the southern continent, the longer he stayed in East and West Balam, the more he felt the similarities between Jutanese and ancient Faisak. Although these two languages obviously followed different systems, making it much more difficult if he were to truly study Jutanese, certain details were shockingly similar, as it was as though they shared a common heritage. Klein could only be certain that the heritage wasn't Jotun. Pretending as though he hadn't noticed anything, he very naturally chatted with May Sanchez until the other party raised the topic of the arms deal. "How many goods do you have in total?" Klein laughed and replied, "It wouldn't be a problem equipping 3,000 to 4,000 people. In addition, there will be a few cannons." May Sanchez fell silent and said, "Name your price." Klein pretended to deliberate and said, "If you wish for me to send the goods to the northern state, the price would be £50,000. If you send your troops to retrieve the goods with me and be responsible for the subsequent transportation and safety, it will only cost £40,000. May Sanchez thought and said, "The latter. Take the down payment and go with my men. Once they see the goods and move it onto our carriages, my men will pay the rest." He paused for a moment and then added, "However, I do not have much Lun gold pounds. So you don't have enough foreign reserves." Klein surveyed the area and said with an unconcerned smile, "You can directly pay me in gold coins, or even gold bars or gold bricks." May Sanchez was rather decisive. He didn't waste any time to nod and say, "Deal. I'll get Haggis to bring my men and money to you tomorrow." "Not bad. I like doing business with people who don't haggle." Klein first heaved a sigh of relief before suspecting if his price was too low. After Klein left the general's residence, May Sanchez suddenly looked up and said to the person above, "Your Excellency Luca, is this the person you're waiting for?" One story above the beautiful staircase, a figure slowly appeared. He was an elder in a white robe with inlaid brass lines. His hair was completely white and neatly combed. His pair of grey-green eyes were so deep that they appeared bottomless. He replied with an unhurried tone, "There's no way to be certain. Although my prophecy tells me that I'll meet the person who can resolve my future predicament in the next 2 days here, that person was too ordinary. Besides being a beyonder, there's nothing worth taking note of. Of course, I can't tell the more profound truth. He might have an existence that's at least not weaker than me behind him." Having said that, he slowly walked down and, after a few seconds, said, "I'll attempt to use a dream to see if I can discover more. Do I need to prepare a special room for you?" May Sanchez asked reverently. Lucas shook his head. "I'll use the activity room here." The best time will be 4 hours later. Don't disturb me before that happens." He then entered the room, sat down, and leaned against the sofa. He relaxed himself, closed his eyes, and fell silent. Only when it slowly turned dark did the old gentleman fall asleep. In the dream, he found himself standing in the hall of the general's residence, standing at the first floor of the beautiful staircase. By the side was May Sanchez and numerous guards. The middle-aged man named Dwayne Dantes was standing opposite him when he suddenly curled his lips into a smile, revealing an exaggerated smile. Flames soared up as poker cards fell from above. Luca's green eyes instantly darkened as Dwayne Dantes's body instantly fell into a strange darkness that appeared. Most up-to-date novels are published on n0velbgn.co/m. The old white-robed gentleman immediately spread his arms open, revealing a dark vortex at his chest. The vortex expanded and devoured Dwayne Dantes. Before Luca could confirm the situation, he felt something. He turned to the side and saw May Sanchez's face squirming and turning tall before instantly becoming another Dwayne Dantes. Almost at the same time, Haggis and all the guards present turned into Dwayne Dantes. All of them were casting their gaze at Luca. Luca was jolted awake, and under the watch of May Sanchez, who had entered at some point in time, he faltered for 2 seconds and said heavily, "I have to personally meet that gentleman from before and see the demigod behind him." Before he finished his sentence, he subconsciously turned his head to look out the window. At this moment, the street lamps lit up. It was dark outside, and the crimson moon's moonlight was strangely tainted with a bloody color. Another blood moon. Thankfully there's Mr. Fool. I must say that there are way too many blood moons this year. It's only been 2 months since the last time. I didn't even have any time to prepare. Force, who sat up, wiped her cold sweat, and muttered silently. She had arrived at a town near Delaire Forest and had checked into a hotel. She shared a room with Zio, and they had made preparations to do some investigations of the abandoned castle early tomorrow morning. To Force's surprise, there was a blood moon just as she was preparing to get some rest. At this moment, she seemed to recall something as her body stiffly turned to the side. Zio, who had exhorted her to sleep early, had already woken up at some point in time. She was looking at her with her eyes open. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 954. Force's gaze met Zio's in midair as both parties remained silent. After a while, Force chuckled dryly. "Ha ha, you haven't fallen asleep?" Zio frowned and said, "What happened to you?" "Nothing. Didn't I tell you before? Whenever the full moon happens, I won't be in a good state." "It's even worse during the blood moon," Force replied as though everything was normal. Zio sized her up and pulled her blanket. "I remember that you brought sleeping pills." "There's no need for that. I'm fine now." Seeing that Zio wasn't pressing further, Force secretly heaved a sigh of relief. "Go back to sleep. We still have to head into the forest early tomorrow morning." Zio didn't say another word as she turned around, gripped the blanket, and closed her eyes. Before long, her breathing turned heavier and became more drawn out and uniform. Force stared blankly at the ceiling as her thoughts ran wild. At some point in time, she fell asleep as well. The next day at noon. In the core region of Delaire Forest, in front of a collapsed, ancient castle covered in green vines. Force wiped the perspiration on her forehead and exhaled. "We're finally here." Zio shot her a glance and said, "The boss at the hotel told me that we only need 2 hours to get here." They had set off before 6 in the morning, but they had spent nearly 7 hours to arrive. The corners of Force's lips twitched as she said, "Ideal conditions and reality are different. There weren't any trails for us to take towards the end. We needed to explore and forge a new path ourselves." Zio took out her triangular blade, nodded, and said, "You should have foreseen this from the beginning, but you refused to have a guide as suggested by the hotel's boss. As an astrologer, I don't believe such trivialities will cause any trouble. Look, aren't we there now? Besides, the time is perfect. The wraiths and ghosts are definitely in their weakest state." Having forced a smile, Force held Leymano's travels in one hand as she pointed with the other. "I didn't notice it before, but the more I think about it, the more puzzled I become." "About what?" Zio also cast her gaze to the ancient abandoned castle that was covered by vines. Force casually found an excuse. "Tell me, who would build a castle in the middle of a forest? Furthermore, they didn't open up a trail to it." Before she finished her sentence, she really found the matter a little odd. Zio thought and said, "Perhaps there was a trail, but after the castle was abandoned, whatever traces of it had been wiped out with time." Force stroked the hair by her ear and shook her head. "Then why would they abandon it? If they had considered safety back when building it, it would be more dangerous building it far from the town in an uninhabited castle. If it's just for vacations, with the way nobles do things, they wouldn't abandon it even if the maintenance and repairs are difficult." Zio blurted out, "Could it be because it's haunted?" Force thought for a few seconds. "Won't someone who can build such a huge castle hire beyond us to deal with the ghosts? I suspect that the 3 churches and the kingdom's government don't know of this ancient castle. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense that they will leave the Beyonder ingredients inside." Upon saying that, she raised a possibility. An ancient castle of the Sanguine? Such extraordinary creatures enjoyed living in places with few people. Furthermore, They were usually connected to dark forests and ancient castles. In addition, information about this ancient castle came from the Sanguine to begin with. It's possible Zio first agreed before disagreeing. Will the Sanguine be afraid of ghosts? They definitely have the means to deal with the ancient wraiths inside. Make sense? Don't tell me those Sanguine don't like money and don't care about the search for Beyonder ingredients. Force recalled Mr. Moon's behavior and denied her hypothesis. In deliberation, she said, unless there's some problem that's not easy to resolve. That's what made the bigwigs choose to skirt around it. In that case, her operation would become more dangerous than she had anticipated. Zio tersely agreed. Let's do some preliminary investigations while the sun is still strong. All right. Force held Leymano's travels and approached the half-collapsed ancient castle one step at a time. The two soon arrived at the entrance, which was two-thirds blocked by rocks. They discovered that, beneath the green vines, the stone walls were mottled and heavily weathered as though it had been in existence for a very, very long period of time. Zio wasn't in a rush to enter. Calling out to Force, they circled around the castle slowly. When they returned to the entrance, she said in puzzlement, "This castle's style is purely defensive. It doesn't seem to consider the problems needed for living in it. Besides, many of the peculiarities of the building are ones I haven't heard of before. It has probably existed in the late 4th epoch or even earlier. What's there to defend again? Beastmen? Treants? They've all gone extinct after the cataclysm. Ha ha, don't tell me that it's a building from the 2nd or 3rd epoch." Force casually replied. She observed the terrain and left the entrance with Zio before arriving at a relatively complete wall. She reached out her palm and pressed on it. Although she lacked combat experience, she was rather skilled when it came to the various aspects before a battle. An illusory light appeared in front of her, allowing Force and Zio to instantly enter the abandoned castle. The first thing that they saw was a collapsed staircase and layers of remnant concrete from above. There were rays of pure sunlight shining in from above, as well as masonry and rotten wood. There weren't any animal or bird feces or any green weeds on the ground. With a whoosh, the wind seeped into their bones, chilling them despite it being noon. Force activated her spirit body and surveyed the area, but she failed to see any spirit bodies. However, she noticed that on the right of a remnant collapsed wall, there was a rather intact stone staircase. The staircase was mottled and scuffed as it extended downwards to an unknown location. "Shall we head over there to take a look?" Force shot a glance at Zio and made a suggestion. From her point of view, everything else in the castle could either be taken in at a glance or collapsed and stacked together. If they wished to do thorough investigations, it was certain that it would take a rather long amount of time. Therefore, it was better to gain a general understanding of the overall picture to assure themselves. Zio glanced around and nodded gently. "The cold wind is gathering underground. I suspect that all the wraiths and ghosts are hidden in the area where the staircase leads to." "Yeah." Force cautiously walked towards the mottled stone staircase and followed the steps, which were covered in gravel, down. The staircase was rather narrow, allowing only one person to pass at a time. Furthermore, they spiraled down, leaving Force shaken. Tap. 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 As their footsteps echoed into the distance, the light that shone inside the staircase darkened. Zio lit the lantern in her hand as Force opened Leymano's Travels, swiping a page with great familiarity. A bright and warm light burst out, illuminating the mottled stairs ahead of them. Tensed, Force and Zio walked down one level at a time. On the way, cold wind blew past them, making them overreact and nearly caused them to launch attacks at non-existent enemies. Tap. 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 In the narrow and silent environment, Force finally walked down the steps and stepped onto rather flat and solid ground. She had originally wanted to say being in a place like this for too long will really make one go mad, but due to the silent and heavy atmosphere around her, she didn't make a sound. She was afraid that breaking the silence would result in extremely terrible developments. Using the blob of light that was floating above her, Force cast her gaze forward in an attempt to see what was at the end of the staircase. It was a huge hall that was nearly 10 meters tall. There were black tiles laid on the ground with water droplets seeping out. There were signs of damage everywhere. F0 low new chapters at november/el/bin/.com. Dozens of meters away, where the light nearly failed to illuminate the other end of the hall, there was a pair of double bronze doors sitting there silently. It went from the bottom to the top, and the rocks on the walls to its side had peeled off. The statues were in shambles, revealing the dark brown mud underneath. The surface of the door was engraved with dense symbols and strange patterns. They had a very mysterious and heavy feel, as though they were sealing something or blocking out something. Force finally couldn't help but say with a hushed tone, "Have you seen such large doors before?" Beside her, Zio shook her head. "No." Force immediately drew a gasp. "Say, what could be behind that door? Where does it lead to? See, could it be the reason for building this castle in the first place? To prevent the creatures behind the door from coming out?" Zio circled the area, but didn't find any murals that could provide any information. All she found was that the closer she was to the bronze door, the more water seeped out from the ground. There were also more and more abandoned silver black swords on the ground. During the 4th and 5th epoch, murals were very common in all castles and buildings. And before the cataclysm, it can be seen from various elvish ruins that supernatural creatures similarly like to use murals to praise their deities and to record their daily lives. Zio said slowly, using her experience and knowledge from being a bounty hunter. Force nodded slightly and said, "That's indeed the case. This ancient castle is more magical than I imagined." At this moment, she felt hesitant. She even had thoughts of leaving and seeking Mr. World's help. Having heard Little Sun describe so many horror stories when exploring abandoned ruins at the tarot gatherings, her mind couldn't help but wonder when placed in a similar situation. She was scaring herself. "Perhaps we can gather more clues by going closer." Zio boldly took a few steps forward and approached the heavy sealed door that seemed to lead somewhere. Force gripped Leymano's travels tightly and hurriedly chased after her. As she walked, she suddenly saw bright redness appear before her. What seeped out from the cracks of the black tiles was no longer water but staggering blood. This? Force immediately flipped open the notebook with a bronze green cover and cast her sight on Zio through the corner of her eye. It was unknown when Zio had turned pale. Her eyes were dark green and her lips were red. The area around her was dark and gloomy as her expression looked extremely distorted. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 955. Force pupils dilated as though she was trying to absorb more light into her eyes to better see Zio's current circumstances. Meanwhile, the light in front of her suddenly exploded with a flash several times more blinding than old-school cameras, blanketing the surroundings with whiteness. Following that, her finger swiped on a page on Leymano's travels as black fog soared from her feet, enveloping her entire body. The thick black fog quickly transformed into palm-sized illusory bats as they flew in different directions of the underground hall. This was Wings of Darkness, which the moon had recorded in Leymano's travels. Its original use was to enhance one's speed and bestow temporary flight capabilities while producing a horde of blood-sucking bats to attack the enemy. However, Force didn't use it for this purpose. Instead, she used it as a prop for her performance. After the illusory bats flew away, the space where Force stood was already empty. At some point in time, she had appeared more than 10 meters away. After subconsciously escaping and defending herself, Force could finally calm down as she hurriedly cast her gaze onto Zio, who had turned abnormal. However, Zio only appeared to have slightly disheveled blonde hair with malt-colored skin due to her continuous forays out in the sun. Besides looking somewhat blank as though she was surprised as to why her friend had such a huge reaction, she didn't show any signs of being influenced by wraiths or ghosts. SOR. As? What happened? Zio asked warily. Force narrowed her eyes without directly replying to her. Flipping through Leymano's travels' pages, she asked, "Zio, how tall are you?" Seemingly realizing something, Zio answered, 152. Isn't that so? Just as she said that, Force's fingers slid across the notebook's page, which was filled with symbols and magical labels. Silently, a holy light swirling with fire plummeted down from above. The unadulterated and bright light instantly enveloped Zio before rippling outward with sunlight. As the blazing light stabbed into Force's eyes, she saw the hall collapse and the surrounding space shatter like glass. This feeling was gone in a flash as Force realized that she was still in her original spot. She had yet to flee. That was an illusion? She hurriedly turned to the side and saw Zio looking at the damaged region of the heavy door. Force deliberated for a moment and asked, "Zio, how tall are you?" Zio glanced at her and angrily said, "Stop asking such inane questions." "Phew, she's real." Force heaved a sigh of relief as she quickly described her encounter to Zio. After a few seconds of thought, Zio used her lantern-wielding hand to nudge Force's arm. "Let's retreat. Perhaps the closer we are to that door, the easier it is to hallucinate." "Yes, that's possible." Force nodded in agreement as she quickly moved back a few steps. Following that, she surveyed the area and asked in puzzlement, "Why can't we find any wraiths or ghosts here? Such an environment should be something that they enjoy." Zio was perplexed as well. She then did a careful observation before landing her gaze on the blob of sunlight floating above Force's head. "Try extinguishing it," she suggested. Force came to a realization as she immediately dispelled the light. Silent darkness blanketed the area and ruled the underground hall once more. Only the lantern's faint yellow light put up a resistance against all of this. Then, Force saw two figures in her spirit vision. They were rather close to the bronze door. One was a female with coiled hair, wearing a knight's trousers and a garish shirt for ease of movement. The other was a man wearing silver-black armor as he held a sword that was almost snapping due to rust. The former's face was a blur as it kept wandering between the door and where Force and Zio arrived. The latter was loitering beside the door, muttering something. "These are the two ancient wraiths." Force nudged Zio and said with a suppressed voice, "I see spirit bodies. I see them as well. They aren't hiding at all." Zio curved her back as she readied herself for a fight. Force hurriedly nudged her. "Don't be hasty. We aren't sure that they're the targets." She attempted to take 3 steps forward, but the two relatively blurry figures didn't even look at her. Force thought and suddenly said, "What are you doing?" She had heard of stories in other mysticism circles that wraiths, shadows, and other higher-level spirit body creatures could be communicated with. However, she regretted it the moment she said that. This was because communication didn't allow her to achieve her goal. There was no way she could persuade the other party to kill themselves and hand over the cursed item and remnant spirituality of an ancient wraith. Oh. Just as Force was considering if she should launch a direct attack, the lady in the garish shirt and knight's trousers replied with a flat tone, "I'm searching for my husband. He's a guard here." Communication is really possible. Force pressed out of curiosity, "Where did he go?" At this moment, Zio approached as she wore a look of extreme vigilance. The blur-figured lady answered blankly, "He's a guard here. He told me that magical power seeps out from behind the door, corrupting his teammates. He got me to leave as quickly as possible with a messenger. He said that he would ensure that I escaped safely, but I don't wish for that. I want to leave with him. After sending off the messenger, I returned midway and returned underground. But I can't find him. With the age of this castle exceeding the present epoch, the last defender has definitely transformed into an ancient wraith. This lady's story has moved me. I really can't bear to attack her." Force mind whirled as she carefully took a few steps and circled around the ancient female wraith and approached the bronze door. This time, she and Zio didn't suffer any more hallucinations. This seemed to imply that her encounter was subconsciously created by the lady. A distance from the silver-black armored knight with a rusty sword, Force attempted to ask, "Sir, what are you doing?" The knight paused and said with a humming voice, "I'm guarding this door of blackness. I need to ensure that my wife has escaped safely. If you meet her, tell her that her knight will fight for her to the very last moment." "Ah. Door of blackness. It's clearly a bronze door. Wait, what did he say? He said that he's guarding the door to ensure that his wife can safely escape. Isn't this the other half of the woman's story which she described? This is her husband? Force was taken aback as she kept looking back and forth between the two ancient wraiths. The lady wearing a garish shirt and knight's trousers slowly approached the bronze door before returning to the middle of the hall repeatedly. As for the silver-black armored man, he was patrolling about the door with a rotting sword in hand. At times, they would pass by without noticing each other. Such a scene must have gone on for at least 1,500 years, or even longer. Force commented silently as she turned to glance at Zio. She realized that her friend's eyes were already welling with tears. What an easily touched person. Force couldn't help it as she shouted at the female wraith, "Look at the door. Your husband has been there all along." The lady slowed down her pace and first glanced at Force before casting her gaze at the heavy door. Her blank gaze penetrated the night, landing behind him. "Why can't I find him?" The wraith repeated her words and repeated her actions. Force felt an inexplicable sense of sorrow, and just as she was about to shout again, she saw the knight turn to look at her and Zio. He shouted, "Who are you?" Just as he said that, the female wraith cast her gaze at Zio and Force again. Force immediately felt her thoughts slow down as a coldness quickly formed inside her body and rippled out, freezing her flesh and joints. As for Zio, she too was suffering from the same condition. The area around the lantern dimmed significantly. At this moment, 2 bolts of lightning lit up in Zio's eyes. This made the wraith let out a painful cry as his body turned faint. Zio instantly escaped from her frozen state and threw out the triangular blade in her hand towards the female wraith. Bolts of illusory lightning swirled around the triangular blade's tip, stabbing straight into the lady. Psychic lashing. The female wraith screamed as her body turned faint. Force instantly snapped awake as she slid her fingers across the open Leymano's travels. Life seemed to immediately gather from the surrounding shadows, turning into a pitch-black chain that restrained the male wraith to the ground, sealing off his mouth. Abyss Chains. Explore new novels on novelbin.com. Meanwhile, Zio rushed out, and with an illusory brand in hand, she stamped it on the female wraith. With her holding back the female wraith, Force's actions became more composed. She flipped through Leymano's travels and slid her fingers. Silver lightning that branched out and blasted out of thin air, smiting the male wraith and turning the area into a lightning hellscape. Finally, a holy pillar of light that had flames swirling around it appeared. It enveloped the male wraith and completely purified him. With one enemy taken down, Force immediately turned and dealt with the female wraith with Zio. She didn't hold back on using powers from Leymano's travels. She came up with wise combinations of them, and using Zio's suppression, she switched between restrainment powers and offense from time to time. Soon, they finished off their target. Everything fell silent as Force heaved a sigh of relief. She then looked at the battlefield with a look of disbelief. Is that it? She originally imagined that 2 ancient wraiths had unique powers, and with their higher levels, they weren't something subsequent 5 Beyonders could deal with. However, she realized that everything happened rather smoothly. This made her truly realize how godly Leymano's travels was. She also began looking forward to the next sequence as a scribe. Zio was somewhat astonished as she thought for a few seconds. It's no wonder someone told me that, beneath the level of demigods, the number of Beyonders, their cooperation, and usage of powers are more important than the sequence. Just as she said that, she heard knocking sounds resonate. It broke the silence of the hall, and it came from behind the bronze door. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 956. Bang! 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 Behind the bronze door, the slamming sounds continued incessantly, echoing throughout the vast underground hall as though they came from an abnormally distant past. Force clamped up and couldn't help but tremble. Unable to help it, she suppressed her voice. What could be behind the door? I've no idea. Zio honestly shook her head, subconsciously gulping. Her right hand, which had just picked up her triangular blade, had her joints protruding out as her blood vessel surfaced. Clearly, she was gripping the triangular blade tightly. Bang! 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 The slamming sounds continued without any change in frequency. Each sound seemed to strike at Force and Zio's hearts, leaving their hair standing and scalps tingling. It likely won't be able to come out, right? If it could so easily come out, it wouldn't have waited until today. Force tried to console herself with parched lips. Zio nodded heavily and said, "We leave once the ingredients form." In such an environment and atmosphere, her curiosity had been completely overwhelmed by her innate fear. All right. As Force glanced at the spots where the two ancient wraiths had been cleansed, she blamed the moon for providing undetailed information. He hadn't mentioned that there was such a strange door beneath the ancient castle. At this moment, glowing dust was landing on the ground like shattered gems, forming into two piles as they gathered together. Around them, nearly formless remnant spirituality condensed into a seemingly ethereal crystal. Accompanied by the crystals and dust were two different items. One was ring-shaped and completely transparent as though it was a corroded ring. The other was an eye carved from crystal, with faint black gas swirling within. Upon seeing this scene, Force suddenly realized something. An ancient wraith was a ghost-like creature with a beyonder characteristic mixed in. The cursed item would be related to a particular item while they were still alive, fusing with the characteristic and turning into a foundation to which they relied on for their existence. It was precisely because of this that different ancient wraiths had different corresponding cursed items in shape and form. However, they were essentially the same. And the dust was another type of characteristic. It was the source of most of their strength, stemming from remnant spirituality, slightly equivalent to the blood and ingredients of monsters. Bang! 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 The entity striking behind the bronze door didn't let up at all. It kept testing Force and Zio's psyche. Being afraid and cautious, the duo's bodies trembled so much that they even imagined that the door was shaking slightly. Their racing hearts were in their throats. With them being able to head for the staircase at any moment, Force finally waited until the ancient wraith's powder and cursed items took form. As she signaled to Zio to be wary, she crouched down and took out 3 square metal boxes she had prepared. After some hesitation, Force looked up at Zio and said, "These two ancient wraiths have been waiting for each other for so long. I am thinking of separating a little of what they left behind and burying them together. In that case, I'll get a cursed item, and you'll get a pile of dust. We'll split the remaining spirituality, all right?" Zio didn't hesitate as she nodded. "All right." Force silently heaved a sigh of relief as she pursed her lips. Flipping through Leymano's travels, she slid her finger across a particular page. The 5 nails on her right hand immediately grew long and sharp, covering black patterns and symbols. This was the claw of corrosion from the sanguine. Upon seeing her palm transform, Force grabbed at the ground, easily digging a hole and leaving behind a corrosive mark. Right on the heels of that, she placed the crystal eyeball-like cursed item and a pile of dust into the hole before filling the hole with the gravel and soil she had dug up. She lightly grazed the flattened ground with her fingernails, writing an epitaph. "Returning for you, defending for you, together forever." After doing all of this, Force sighed when she heard the slamming behind the bronze turn louder. Bam! She jumped in fright and hurriedly placed the pile of dust, ring-shaped curse item, and remnant spirituality into the different square metal boxes. Then, she put the boxes away, stood up, and slowly walked to the spiraling and cramped staircase with Zio. Bang! 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 The slamming sounds behind the bronze door grew intense as Force and Zio subconsciously gritted their teeth, following the staircase and rapidly heading up. They increased their speed until they began running. They ignored the possibility of falling on the staircase and tumbling down like a wheel. Finally, Force and Zio saw sunlight. Sunlight beamed in from outside, shining upon the staircase ahead of them. It was bright, pure, and warm. At this moment, the slamming sounds from underground had come to a sudden stop without any follow-up. Force and Zio exchanged looks, slowed down their pace, and after a few large strides, returned to the top of the abandoned ancient castle. The duo didn't say a word and directly left the area, returning to the periphery of the forest. After walking for some time, Force calmed down and pursed her lips. It was really terrifying. Although the thing behind the bronze door didn't deal any harm to us, nor did it even show itself, I think it was more terrifying than the ancient wraiths. Compared to all my past experience, Sue, it's far more terrifying. In those few minutes, I couldn't help but imagine all the different tragic deaths I might suffer. Each one was more terrifying than the last, but none of them were as terrifying as the slamming sounds. Zio turned her head and agreed with a nod. Yeah. I felt as though I was walking on the edge of a cliff. Force was about to continue when she saw 2 streams of bright red blood flowing down Zio's nose. Zio. Your nose is bleeding. Force hurriedly warned her friend. Zio was taken aback as her pupils dilated. You too? Ah? Force blankly reached out her hand and wiped her nose. It felt warm to the touch, wet and sticky. She was appalled as she hurriedly held her right hand in front of her and saw red blood smeared across it. It was bright and striking. A result from being overly anxious? Force muttered in puzzlement. At this moment, through the sunlight diffusing through the forest's canopy, she realized that faint black spots were quickly growing on her wrists at a discernible pace. The black spots rapidly spread, covering her arms and the back of her hands. Ah! Force subconsciously cried out as she hurriedly looked at Zio. She saw Zio's cheeks and neck covered with black spots. This isn't normal. Force blurted out. Zio sensed the abnormality happening to the both of them as she recalled and said, Do you still remember what that female wraith said? She said that the guards from before had been corrupted by the forces that seeped out from behind the bronze door. Could it be that we've been corrupted? Force was taken aback for a second before she nodded heavily. It's possible. She hurriedly took out the medicine that she had prepared, handing over some of it to Zio. Then, she twisted the lid off and down 2 bottles. However, they didn't show any signs of recovering. The black spots grew in number, turning their vision blurry. Badump! Badump! Before long, Force, whose efforts to save herself were in vain, could hear her heartbeat and sense her body beginning to lose strength. Out of ideas, she quivered her lips, clenched her teeth, and turned her body around. She took a few steps to open up a distance from Zio. Then, she bowed her head and chanted Mr. Fool's honorific name. In about 10 seconds, she saw dark red light appear, engulfing her like the tide. The ravings and roaring vanished, and Force saw the familiar mottled table and the 10 high-backed chairs opposite her. She then realized that her dizziness and blurred vision had vanished. There weren't any more of the strange, accentuated black spots on her spirit body. Thank you for your help. Force hurriedly stood up and bowed at the figure shrouded in grey fog at the end of the long bronze table. Then, she heard Mr. Fool say in a calm tone, Your spirit had been corrupted by some force. Most up-to-date novels are published on n0velbgn.co/m. It should be fine now. Cleansed by Mr. Fool? Force's heart stirred. Just as she wanted to make a request to Mr. Fool regarding how Zio could be saved, the scene before turned red as light soared up. After a brief pause, she found herself in the real world, back in Delaire Forest. The black spots on the back of her hands and wrists were rapidly fading and receding. The blood that kept dripping from her nose had already come to a stop. Returning to her body, she saw Zio weakly slumped on a tree. Her face was covered in black spots, making her look terrifying. The muscles on both sides of her neck were tensed up as her mind spun. A few seconds later, she walked over quickly, pressed Zio on the shoulders, and rapidly said, I have a way to save you, but you need to follow my instructions. Use ancient Hermes to say this, the fool that doesn't belong to this era. Zio could hardly turn her swollen eyelids. Looking at Force for 2 seconds, she heavily chanted, the fool that doesn't belong to this era. The mysterious ruler above the grey fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck. Just as she said that, Zio saw dark red starlight surge out from the void, sweeping over her. Indescribable roars continued for a second before vanishing from Zio's ears. She then saw herself seated in an ancient and majestic palace. She was sitting beside a mottled, bronze table. At her feet was a boundless greyish-white fog. In front of her was a lofty figure looking down upon her. This scene was both unfamiliar and familiar to her. She had once seen it in a dream, but she hadn't ever had it again after the exorcism ritual. That purification was actually useless. Zio suddenly had this thought as she stood up in deliberation, bowing at the figure enshrouded in grey fog. "You are the great king of yellow and black?" She didn't appear too surprised or alarmed, as though she had already expected it. "You can call me Mr. Fool." "Have a seat," the figure with an epic aura replied calmly. Zio bowed again and sat down, confirming that she had escaped her unwell state. She looked to her sides and thought before asking, "Honorable Mr. Fool, does Force Wall have a seat here?" Shrouded in the grey fog, the fool nodded gently and said, "Yes." Zio fell silent for a second and directly asked, "Can I join just like her?" The fool chuckled. "It's a gathering they organized on their own accord, but is convened by me. There's still a seat available at present. You may join. Draw a card." They use one of the major arcana cards as their code name. Zio didn't ask or speak further. She immediately nodded. "Yes, Mr. Fool." On the bronze table in front of her, a deck of tarot cards immediately appeared. Zio reached out her right hand and solemnly cut the deck, pulled out one card, and flipped it over. Her card depicted an angel with a trumpet and the sleeping dead awaiting salvation, the Judgment card. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 957. Looking at the Judgment card in hand, Zio was taken aback. "This greatly meets my expectations." Shrouded in the grey fog, the fool nodded and calmly said, "The gathering is held here at 3 in the afternoon on Mondays, Backland time. Be prepared. During the gathering, you can exchange information, ingredients, formulas, and knowledge. You can also pay a certain price to entrust missions to the other members." Zio recalled for a moment before nodding in enlightenment. "Yes, Mr. Fool." Believing that this was all for the day, she heard the voice coming from the end of the bronze table. "What did you do before being corrupted by that force?" "We really were corrupted." Zio composed herself and completely recounted her exploration of the ancient castle with force. She emphasized the bronze door which had been named the Door of Blackness, as well as the ancient castle's guard that had been reduced to a wraith due to the corruption. Then, she noticed Mr. Fool nod slightly as he said calmly, "Don't enter that ancient castle again before you reach sequence 4. It's time for you to return." Zio then got up, and following the descriptions in the religious rituals, she bowed and said, "Your wish is my wish." Just as she said that, the dark red color surged in front of her. After everything dissipated, she was back in the real world and leaning against a thick tree. Subconsciously looking at the back of her hand, she realized that the black spots were rapidly turning faint. Zio looked up at Force, who was staring at her worriedly. As their gazes met, Force was first delighted before revealing a smile. She opened her mouth but was at a loss for words. Zio slowly exhaled and pointed ahead. "Let's first return to the town." "All right." Force answered without any hesitation. At this moment above the grey fog, the fool Klein was tapping on the edge of the mottled table as he considered Miss Magician and Miss Judgment's encounter. The object or power sealed behind the Door of Blackness could still corrupt the guards and explorers outside, even without escaping. Just the mere thought of it was terrifying. Furthermore, this corruption stemmed from the spirit body. To resolve it, Klein had only two solutions. One was to make the corrupted entity hold a complete secret deed ritual as he used the powers above the grey fog and the sun brooch to complete a purification. The other was to directly pull the spirit body over, using the grey fog to cleanse them. As he didn't have the luxury of time, he had chosen the latter. What could it be? The most corruptive power belongs to the devil pathway. That place connects to the abyss? That's not impossible. Based on Little Sun's description, during the early and mid stages of the Second Epoch, devils often left the abyss and were active over the land. It was only when the ancient sun god appeared, causing ancient gods to perish one after another, did they retreat into the abyss and seal themselves in. Based on that, it's rather normal to have an underground ancient entrance in the northern continent to lead to the abyss. It can also be imagined that a castle is built with men sent to watch over it. But the problem lies in the fact that it's been millennia. Why would there still be an existence slamming the door? Are the devils planning on returning? Klein made a preliminary guess. He temporarily had no plans on exploring the abandoned castle to verify his thoughts, because it was unlikely that there would be any changes anytime soon. After all, since it was news that came from the Sanguine, he could get the Moon Emlyn to do some gathering of information to figure out the history of the castle. Reining in this thought, Klein removed the topaz chain from his wrist and divined if the matter regarding the ancient castle was pressing. He received a negative answer. He immediately returned to the real world and waited for the local ruler, General May Sanchez, to send over the down payment. At 2 in the afternoon, Fainapota time, Haggis, with his hair combed backward while dressed as a northern continent gentleman, carried a black leather suitcase with a team of guards as he knocked on Dwayne Dantes' door. "Please come on in." A warm and elegant voice sounded from the inside. It was first Lonese in a Backland accent before it was changed to the local language of Jutanese. Haggis turned the doorknob and entered. He saw Dwayne Dantes with his white sideburns and deep, blue eyes stand up from his reclining chair while pressing down the ends of his black vest. "Good afternoon, my friend." This Lund gentleman with good looks and bearings took 2 steps forward and extended his right palm. This time, he switched to using Lonese. Haggis replied using the accent of a Lonese noble, "It's my honor to be your friend." After he shook hands with Dwayne Dantes, he surveyed the area and chuckled. "Is this your servant?" He pointed at a mixed-blood youth standing behind the arms dealer. In between the lines, he was asking if he was trustworthy. After all, Dwayne Dantes hadn't brought any servants back when he visited the general's residence yesterday. Yes, his greatest strength is the ability to keep secrets. Dwayne Dantes smiled as he pointed to the leather sofa across the reclining chair. With 2 guards following Haggis, he closed the door and sat down. He then said with a smile, "I've heard of an Intis proverb that's said to be from Emperor Razel. He said that dead men tell no tales." Dwayne Dantes said with a laugh. "Emperor Razel also said something else. Corpses can speak. Is that so?" "This is my first time hearing of this." Haggis enjoyed conversing with a northern continent gentleman, so they continued their conversation for a while before he lifted up the leather suitcase beside him and opened it. At that instant, there seemed to be overflowing golden lustres. Under the illumination from the sunlight outside, the entire room seemed to brighten significantly. Haggis then looked at Dwayne Dantes and said, 5,000 Lund gold pounds, as well as 5,000 gold coins and gold bars. This is the down payment. I'll bring along the remaining 30,000 pounds in cash and gold the entire time, and will hand it over when the arms deal is completed. Dwayne Dantes scanned the stacks of cash, the gold coins, and gold bars in the leather suitcase before retracting his gaze and saying with a smile, "When do we set off?" Haggis closed the leather suitcase and handed it to Dwayne Dantes' servant and said simply, "Tomorrow morning." He paused for 2 seconds before saying, "Mr. Dantes, the general has a guest who would like to meet you." Dwayne Dantes' expression didn't change as he fell silent for a few seconds. "When?" "Now," Haggis said without daring to show any signs of being perfunctory. "He's downstairs." Dwayne Dantes nodded slightly. "Please invite him up." Haggis immediately heaved a sigh of relief and left with his guards. They followed the stairwell down. Before long, Luca, in a simple white robe with brass lines adorning it, walked up. His silver hair had been combed very neatly. When he arrived by Dwayne Dantes' door, he heard a voice from the inside just as he raised his hand. "Please come in." This time they spoke using ancient Faesac. Luca's expression didn't change as he naturally pushed open the door. He then saw the middle-aged gentleman who had rather good looks and qualities from yesterday standing beside a reclining chair facing him. And sitting on the reclining chair was a young man. He had black hair and brown eyes, with a thin, cut face. He had a cold temperament. Luca was taken aback as he took a step forward, entered the room, and closed the door. After he sat down on the sofa in a composed manner, his grey-green eyes clearly reflected the young man in front of him. German Sparrow? Luca addressed him with a rhetorical question. German Sparrow curled the corners of his mouth. Directly addressing others by their full name is impolite. Luca nodded and said, "My apologies for my faux pas. I recall that you advanced to sequence 5 less than half a year ago, or it might have only been 3 months. Yes, it should have been completed when you were in the ruins of the battlefield of gods. I never expected that you were already a demigod. It left me a little bewildered." German Sparrow smiled without giving any explanations. After a brief moment of silence, he said in an unhurried tone, "Why are you visiting me?" Luca calmly replied, "I don't know." The atmosphere in the room suddenly turned somewhat odd. German Sparrow seemed to forget that there was an elderly man sitting opposite him that needed him to speak again. Luca indiscernibly nodded and said, "This is the thing, I made a prophecy by chance not too long ago. In that prophecy, I will be in a rather thorny situation in the future. And one of the people I met with over these few days will help me deal with it. I'm not sure if it's you, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. So I decided to meet you and get to know each other. My name is Luca Brewster, a clergyman who serves the God of knowledge and wisdom. I'm presently in charge of various matters in West Balaam." German Sparrow nodded and said, "Not bad. I now know you. I don't believe I need to introduce myself, right?" "Of course," Luca thought and said. "You should be a bizarro sorcerer. I recently received some intel that there has been some reshuffling among the secret order in Intes." He didn't see German Sparrow reveal any looks of shock. This powerful adventurer, who was famous across the 5 seas, said after a moment of silence, "Zaratul has returned." The look in Luca's eyes changed immediately before being restored to normal. Then, he stood up and nodded. "Since we've gotten to know each other, it's time we bid farewell." After saying this, he walked to the door, twisted the doorknob, and left the room. Sitting on the reclining chair, German Sparrow watched as his figure was concealed inch by the wooden door until he completely disappeared. Then, he chuckled. What a charlatan. Yes. Dwayne Dantes, who was standing beside the reclining chair, found a seat and sat down. Then, he picked up a cup of tea and sipped from it. With white sideburns and deep blue eyes, he and the thin, angular-faced German Sparrow exchanged looks and smiled in unison. On Monday afternoon, Dwayne Dantes took out his golden pocket watch, opened it, and said to Haggis opposite him, "We're almost arriving at our destination. I believe you and your men need some rest." An excellent suggestion. Haggis was rather agreeable. Dwayne Dantes pointed at the street ahead. "Explore new novels on novelbin.com. There's a hotel ahead. Let's rest there for half a day before we set off again tomorrow." Haggis didn't object to it as he turned to the front and instructed the carriage driver. After checking into the hotel, Dwayne Dantes declined Haggis's invitation for afternoon tea by using an afternoon nap as an excuse. Slightly more than half an hour later, above the boundless grey fog, Klein sat in the seat belonging to the fool. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 958. Dark red beams shot up, materializing into different figures on both sides of the long bronze table. The unchanging silence above the grey fog was broken as the Eternal Palace seemed to have an additional, inexplicable sense of life to it. Just as Justice Audrey regained her senses of her surroundings, she prepared to stand up to greet the existence at the end of the long bronze table. At this moment, as a senior spectator, she acutely noticed a difference. There were 2 more members than last week. One of them was a man sitting to the right of Mr. Moon. The other was a lady sitting to the left of the hermit. Audrey first felt happy that the Tarot Club was developing and becoming stronger, but then she kept to her professional instincts and quickly began observing. Due to where she sat, the man opposite her was much easier to observe compared to the lady 2 seats away from her. Therefore, she placed her attention on the man. Black hair. Green eyes, He doesn't wear a coat. A vest matched with a shirt. He sits a little oddly. He's not accustomed to sitting properly. He's probably about 180 centimeters tall. He has quite a desultory temperament. He's rather tense. At one glance, Justice Audrey had read plenty of information from the rather blurry figure. She then noticed something different. The man was quickly surveying his surroundings. Such an action wasn't a problem in itself. Anyone who came to this strange and secret location would definitely subconsciously size up the other members and attempt to grasp their traits and general situation so as to calm down. But the problem was that the man was moving his gaze too quickly. His gaze had swept past the moon, the hanged man, and the other members without pausing. To Audrey, this was a very clear phenomenon. It didn't mean that the man was observing his surroundings and studying the members, but that he was finding someone. He was looking for someone he had in mind. Audrey instantly felt a little excited, as she believed that this newcomer knew one of the members present. Who could it be? She observed for another second and realized that the man sitting diagonally opposite her had fixed his gaze on the World German Sparrow. Audrey was thrilled as though she had discovered a secret. She thought in enlightenment, the newcomer is a friend of Mr. World, or it's at least the case that they know each other in the real world. He also knows that he's a Tarot Club member. Or it could also be said that Mr. World had inducted him into the gathering. No, that's not very possible. If that were the case, the newcomer would be much more certain. He wouldn't be eagerly searching for someone he knows. He definitely would have placed his gaze on the other members for a longer period of time. Furthermore, such an action also proves that he's not abreast of Mr. Fool. What is his relationship with Mr. World? Audrey held onto her thoughts of continuing to observe as she stood up and turned to face the seat. Explore new novels on novelbin.com. Of honor. During this process, she took the opportunity to sweep her gaze at the new member sitting beside Hermit. She's exchanging looks with Miss Magician. Her height. Zio has finally passed the test and joined the gathering? Upon identifying her, Audrey did a curtsy towards the figure shrouded in grey fog. Good afternoon, Mr. Fool Tilda. Just as she issued the brisk greeting, she realized something. Mr. Fool is a little different from before. This great existence seemed to be more one with the entire grey fog, palace, and space. His aura was lofty and mighty, like the sea or sky. This feeling isn't something that can be described with words. Mr. Fool has taken one more step to his awakening, allowing him to retrieve more of his authority over his divine kingdom? Audrey's eyes darted around, feeling curious and delighted, as well as a little sense of pride. At this moment, the hanged man Alger and the hermit cat Lear had noticed the two new members. They noticed that the lady was a little short and was secretly exchanging signals with Miss Magician. She was both unfamiliar but also familiar with the tarot gathering. At the very least, she was unlike the man in the white shirt and black vest. He had frantically stood up only after everyone began bowing. In addition, they sensed that the new male member took special notice of the World German Sparrow, causing them to have many guesses. These thoughts resonated in their minds, but they didn't express them. The hanged man and the hermit completed the usual first steps of the gathering with Miss Justice. As for the son Derek, he was just happy because the Tarot Club had new members again. The Moon Emlyn had mixed feelings. On the one hand, he felt a sense of superiority being more senior compared to the newcomers, but on the other hand, he had a feeling that there were just too many messiahs for the apocalypse. After some searching, the star Leonard determined that the one sitting at the bottom end of the long bronze table was Klein Moretti. This was because his physical characteristics were similar to that of German Sparrow's description. He's hiding his true identity. He doesn't relax even in such a secretive gathering, using 2 levels of disguises. I have to take note. Just as this thought flashed across his mind, Leonard saw the girl sitting to the left of Mr. Fool stand up. Then, she led everyone into bowing. He was taken aback, failing to react in time. He stood out when amongst all the standing members. After a second, Leonard snapped back to his senses and hurriedly stood up to deliver the greeting. Opposite him, Zio glanced at him, equating him to force to a certain extent. Force shared the same thought, however, she had equated the man with Zio to a certain extent. This was because Zio had appeared rather unreliable when they first met. This is the star, and this is judgment. Take your seats and introduce yourself. The fool Klein raised his right hand and casually pointed. The name the star keeps making me think that it's the code name for a lady. As Leonard thought in exasperation, he focused and began labeling the members in the order of their introduction. Miss Justice. Seems like a young lady, but she might have donned 2 levels of disguise like Klein. She's rather optimistic and cheerful. Although I can't tell the details of her attire, it appears to be very classy. Mr. Hanged Man Burly, restrained. He's likely to be a straightforward but rash person. Miss Magician. The way she looks at me is weird. From time to time, she will glance at Klein. I've no idea what's on her mind. She seems rather ordinary overall with nothing standing out. Mr. Sunday. He's very tall, but the way he speaks sounds like he's going through puberty. Although he's silent, he does seem rather friendly. Miss Hermita, Hermit. She exudes a mature and staid demeanor. She's likely a very experienced beyonder. Mr. Moon. Rather young and looks a little reserved. Makes me feel like I've seen him somewhere before, but I can't recall it. I'll continue observing. Miss Judgment. Very short with very obvious traits. However, I can't be sure if she has donned 2 levels of disguises. The World. Very, very gloomy. This is likely his disguise? Well, it might also be his true nature. He wasn't a demigod before, meaning that this gathering has no lack of mid-sequence beyond us. I wonder if I'm the weakest one. As Leonard was observing the other members, Judgment Zio Doricho was also using her powers as a sheriff to extract the traits of the different members and keeping them in mind. A noble lady. Sailor or a crew member. Rather young and introverted, but it's not serious. Rather strong. The leader of at least a mid-sized team. Arrogant, of pretty good family background. Desultory, not staid. Gloomy, terrifying. Amidst their thoughts, the other members finished their self-introduction. The hermit Catlear looked towards the end of the long bronze table and said with a bow, "Honorable Mr. Fool, I didn't receive any new Roselle diary pages this time." Didn't receive. Does this mean that Queen Mystic didn't reply? I wonder what Bernadette is busy with. The fool Klein nodded and calmly replied, "Begin the transactions then." As he said that, Audrey noticed the reactions of the hermit and the hanged man. She realized that they had yet to notice Mr. Fool turning loftier and sublime. Was I the only one who noticed it? Audrey darted her eyes slightly in thought, feeling somewhat poignant and a little happy. Of course, she also knew that Hermit and Mr. Hanged Man didn't dare to look at Mr. Fool too much, especially the former. Most of the time, she only dared to look at the table edge in front of Mr. Fool. Table edge. There's an additional card of blasphemy. Audrey's gaze froze before she retracted it in pleasant surprise. With her intuition as a spectator, she was quite certain that the obtaining of the new card of blasphemy was likely to be the same matter as the World German Sparrow's mental problems, but with different outcomes. She hesitated for a moment and observed the area. I have nothing I need. Catlear, Derek, Emlyn, and Force had already made preparations and were about to advance, therefore, they didn't have any requests. Likewise for Alger, who was still digesting his potion. Instead, it was Leonard who had the desire to purchase a mystical item. However, with no one showing him an example, he was momentarily unsure how to begin. All he could do was divert some attention to considering Mr. Fool's need for Roselle diaries. After selling Tinder, he wasn't lacking in money. Furthermore, having had the experience using creeping hunger, he realized that having a powerful mystical item was rather useful. At this point, Force looked at the silent Zio before looking opposite her. Mr. Hanged Man, I have a material that I wish to be made into a mystical item by that artisan. She was referring to the ancient wraith powder that Zio had. Alger shook his head. That artisan has been controlled by some members of the Rose school of thought who believe in the primordial moon. That's all I know. The subsequent matters have been left to Hermit to handle. Rose school of thought? Primordial moon believers? Left to Hermit to handle. Leonard and Zio looked around and suddenly realized that the gathering they were participating in wasn't as loose as they imagined. They were secretly traversing through the shadows of the world. Lord of the Mysteries, Chapter 959. Katlia turned her body slightly to the side and looked at the magician. It's a little complicated. I suggest that you wait for another 1 to 2 weeks. I'm unable to promise anything. All I can say is that there should be someone to help you create the mystical item when the time comes. Should be someone. It also means that it might not be the original artisan. Does this mean that she's planning on nurturing an artisan for herself? Or could it be that she's thinking of a way to turn the original artisan into a sealed artifact, using a machine to create machines? Hermit is indeed an experienced beyonder. Leonard listened quietly while doing some analysis. It was the first time he was this serious during a meeting. No problem. Force had the utmost confidence in Hermit. After all, she had already obtained the mythical creature's blood and was likely to undergo a qualitative change in time. At this moment, she heard the world say with a hoarse voice, "If this matter requires my help, you can get my help." Decline, the mother tree of Desire's abnormal interest in the grey fog, as well as Emperor Razel's warning to be careful of the moon, which made him, who was determined to figure out the secret of transmigration and the door of light, take note of matters involving the Rose school of thought and the primordial moon believers more than ever before. Furthermore, the artisan was now involved in both matters. Katlia never expected the world to offer his help. After some silence, she nodded slightly. All right. If I'm unable to handle it, I'll seek your help through Mr. Fool. She had deliberately said through Mr. Fool to inform the 2 newcomers that the Tarot Club had a magical way of contacting one another. There was no need for them to be stumped or be in a dilemma in such aspects. It was something they would understand in due time. As the pirate admiral with the highest bounty across the 5 seas, and as a pirate crew leader of hundreds of subordinates, she wasn't doing this solely out of goodwill, nor was she worried that the 2 newcomers would affect the progress of the gathering because of excessive questions. Instead, it was a way to assert dominance in front of newcomers. Of course, unless time was of the essence, leaving Katlia no time to set up a ritual, she would in fact rather summon German Sparrow's messenger than trouble Mr. Fool. Seek help through Mr. Fool. Zio vaguely understood something and held back her urge to look at Force. Seek help through Mr. Fool? Leonard's thoughts raced quickly as he made a guess. Seeing that someone had begun, he relaxed a little and deliberated for a few seconds. Then, he said, I need a mystical item. What kind? Audrey answered at the perfect time to prevent an awkward atmosphere from descending upon the area. Leonard verbally showed his indecision and subconsciously replied, I don't know. He only had such a plan, but he hadn't thought carefully into the details. He only realized that there was this possibility after being pulled into the gathering. Doesn't know. Is he an idiot? The fool Klein, who knew Leonard's desultoriness and casualness, resisted the urge to laugh and criticized him inwardly. Seeing everyone's gaze fall on him with mixed expressions, Leonard immediately felt embarrassed as he hurriedly added, I mean there are no limits on the type. As long as it's geared towards offense, has rather stealth-oriented attributes, and lesser negative side effects, it would be fine by me. This was to boost his nightmare's control to its full extent. At times, he could control a target by himself while Pallas Zoroast controlled the mystical item, giving the dazed opponent a lethal strike. Once he became a spirit warlock, with a natural spirit or wraith or shadow sealed in his teeth to aid him, he could do 2 or even 3 things at a time. After Mr. Starr finished his explanation, Alger didn't harp over the details. He asked, roughly what level is needed? Somewhere around a grade 2 sealed artifact, but slightly stronger. Corresponding to sequence 5 or 6. Leonard had habitually described the item using the parlance of an official beyonder before switching to more common terminology. At that instant, a thought flashed across the minds of Audrey, Katlia, Alger, and Zio. Mr. Star is an official Beyonder, or at least he once was. From their point of view, although Beyonders that didn't belong to any official organization would at times use the concept of grades when describing sealed artifacts, they wouldn't consider using such a vague description when precision was needed in expressing their thoughts and requests. One would often choose a method of explanation that was more direct and easier to understand. Therefore, the conclusion easily appeared. This way, things turned way more interesting. Mr. World is actually very familiar with an official Beyonder. How did they get to know each other? Why would he rope in an official Beyonder into the Tarot Club? Audrey didn't say a word as she maintained her state as a spectator while enjoying herself. At this moment, Alger tersely acknowledged. A mystical item at sequence 5 costs at least £9,000. For one that matches your request, it can typically exceed £12,000. Very frank. Leonard nodded. I understand. After hearing his reply, Klein nearly facepalmed as he sighed inwardly. Ain't you showing your hidden card to Mr. Hangman by doing so? New chapters will be fully updated at n.el/bin.com. I dare bet that if he has something suitable, the price will definitely be above £12,000. Aside from the £7,000 from Tinder, Leonard still actually has other savings. With the guidance of a grandpa from the Marauder pathway, he has likely amassed quite a bit. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to purchase Tinder. I get it. He's not afraid of being fleeced because he still can purchase from the Hermits of Fate. He can compare the traits and prices from both sides. But the problem is that gathering happens once every half a year. It's totally not at the tarot gathering's pace. At this moment in time, Klein couldn't help but consider selling items to the dear poet that had repeated effects or were of little use after becoming a demigod. He then heard Mr. Hanged Man reply in a deep and calm manner, "All right. I'll keep an eye out for you." Okay. Katlia and the other members expressed their stance as well. Following that, there weren't any transactions, allowing the gathering to automatically enter the free exchange segment. Without waiting for Mr. Hanged Man to inquire, Derek raised his hand and said, "I'm already back in the City of Silver. The chief has informed me that we will begin another round of preliminary explorations of the Giant King's Court shortly. Does he mean that I should make use of this time to advance to become a priest of light? Giant King's Court? Explorations of the Giant King's Court?" Leonard cast his gaze to the pubescent youth 1 seat away from him in surprise. From what he knew, the Giant King's Court had already been destroyed long ago in the Second Epoch. Pallas Zoroast, as an angel, had already said that it had vanished from the rivers of time. To his surprise, the son of the Tarot Club was about to explore the area, but none of the members were astonished. Yes, not one of them. Leonard subconsciously looked at Miss Judgment, who was also a newcomer, but he realized that she was apparently aware of this and had remained rather calm. This Miss Magician has privately kept Miss Judgment up to speed. Only Leonard doesn't know anything. The fool Klein leaned into his seat and seriously analyzed himself. After he pulled Leonard above the grey fog and assigned him the star card, he had ignored him. He didn't even write to him or introduce the Tarot Club's general situation to him. Compared to women, men truly aren't meticulous with the details. Klein was just about to control the world German to explain to the star Leonard when he saw the Moon Emling glance at the poet beside him and say with a rather faint smile, "The Giant King's Court is in the forsaken land of the gods." After saying that, he ignored Leonard's reaction, and he said to the son, "Have you obtained the ingredients to Priest of Light?" He knew that someone had only received the formula just 1 to 2 weeks ago. "Yes, I've gotten it from Mr. World," Derek answered honestly, but he didn't go into the details of the transaction. At this moment, Leonard's mind was filled with the words "forsaken land of the gods" and "Giant King's Court." He had a feeling like he had walked out of a fantasy or myth. He instinctively reassessed his knowledge of the Tarot Club, realizing the weight of the simple words of how the members come from different places. Even the churches of the 7 deities are unable to find the forsaken land of the gods, but the Tarot Club can do so. It has even roped in a member from there. Right, Isaac Eggers, who I believe wields the death card, doesn't appear at the gathering. Apart from the members here, there are others that come directly under Mr. Fool. It's as I first imagined. It's a secret organization that might develop into an orthodox church. It's not much weaker than the Aurora Order or Rose School of Thought, and it might even be stronger in certain aspects. This is really a divine council. Amidst Leonard's thoughts, Alger agreed with Derek's guess. That's what it is. Exploring the Giant King's Court is a very dangerous matter. He wishes that you quickly grow stronger to resist that Elder Shepherd's level. Derek nodded in vague acknowledgement. I get it. Thank you, Mr. Hanged Man. He then shared information about what he saw at Noir City, leaving Leonard and Zio dumbfounded. They had no idea how such a strange state and atmosphere was generated. However, the fool Klein noticed something familiar. He felt that Noir City and the foggy town resembled each other to a certain degree. The walking crowd was suspected to be lifeless marionettes. Could it be that there's a higher sequence item of the seer pathway or some monster there? Klein didn't say a word as he silently took note of Noir City. At this moment, Zio glanced at the world and said, showcasing some goodwill, MI9 has recently been investigating German Sparrow's origins. Lord of the Mysteries Chapter 960. Upon hearing the name German Sparrow, all the members on both sides of the long bronze table looked at the world. No one spoke or interjected. They more or less knew that the crazy adventurer, German Sparrow, had once again done something huge such as killing Admiral Hell Ludwell. However, Audrey didn't believe that this was the main reason why he would suffer mental problems. And the way they acted made Leonard instantly realize a fact: everyone in the Tarot Club knew that the world was German Sparrow. Klein's disguise is really well done. However, why does he let the other members know of his identity as German Sparrow? Isn't it common sense to hide one's background at such gatherings? Amidst his puzzlement, Leonard heard the blur-figured the world reply with a hoarse voice, "What clues has MI9 obtained?" Zio showed no shame in betraying MI9 as she replied frankly, "They have confirmed that the identity German Sparrow is fabricated and that it was sourced from Backland." Indeed, he was previously known as Sherlock Moriarty. He became German Sparrow after leaving Backland. However, Sherlock Moriarty isn't his real identity either. Leonard subconsciously surveyed the area and realized that, although the other members weren't surprised, they didn't seem to show any signs of realizing it. Hence, he believed that their knowledge of Klein was only at the uppermost surface. Under Klein's control, the world German Sparrow chuckled and answered Miss Judgment's information. There's no need to bother about such matters. To him, to figure out who the fake identity of German Sparrow was given to, one had to first capture Queen Mystic Bernadette, or one had to obtain news of Sharon from her. Clearly, the level of difficulty made it nearly impossible. In comparison, if they did the same as Leonard, starting off from the events in which Detective Sherlock Moriarty was involved in, there was a chance of them figuring out more. However, since MI9 had chosen the wrong direction, Klein was happy to see them take the futile route. Mr. World is unperturbed and very confident. Zio retracted her gaze and didn't continue. At this moment, Audrey deliberated and asked, "Mr. World, will you be returning to Backland in the future? Will you still use the identity of Dwayne Dantes?" As a qualified psychiatrist, she obviously wasn't going to inform the mental problems of the world to the other members of the Tarot Club. She only wanted to confirm if he would still return to the Lund Charity Bursary Foundation. That way, she could be in closer contact to him in the real world, allowing for a better checkup. She didn't conceal the matter about Dwayne Dantes, since the original members already knew of it. As for Mr. Starr, he was clearly familiar with Mr. World. As for Zio, she had forced to inform her ahead of time. Ah. Upon hearing Miss Justice's words, Leonard nearly couldn't believe his ears as he felt a little confused. Klein Moretti is equivalent to Dwayne Dantes? I've once asked Dwayne Dantes to his face about Klein Moretti. No, it's impossible. Dwayne Dantes is an undying creature who has lived since the Fourth Epoch. The way he acted is sufficient proof. Old Man said the same too. At that moment, Leonard was unable to control his tumultuous emotions. He instinctively rejected the fact that Miss Justice had conveyed. If what appeared here was his astral projection, he felt that his expressions would be rather obvious, oscillating between red and white. Opposite Leonard, Zio looked up as well, looking at Mr. World with puzzlement. His Dwayne Dantes? Dwayne Dantes is German Sparrow? I even accepted his butler's mission. I even protected him before. I even pitied him. He can squash me to death with one hand. Zio then turned her head and glared at Force. I don't dare to say too much about Mr. World. I could only briefly mention a little. Force turned her eyes away in guilt as she mumbled silently. Alja and Catlear figured out something from the duo's reactions. Miss Magician and Miss Judgment knew each other in the real world. Miss Judgment had once interacted with Dwayne Dantes before, but she didn't know that he was German Sparrow. As a senior spectator, Audrey noticed the abnormalities of the Star and Judgment without a doubt. Immediately, she understood that she had made too many assumptions. Audrey, you need to reflect on this, she said to herself in embarrassment, and attempted to make up for it before Mr. World spoke. Dwayne Dantes is a public identity. At times, it will be Mr. World, and at other times, it will be the other blessed of Mr. Fool. So that's how it is. Makes sense. Leonard's mind stirred as he instantly accepted Miss Justice's explanation and figured out many different matters. The Dwayne Dantes that appeared during the period before the breaching of St. Samuel Cathedral's Channy's Gate was likely Klein. The periods before and after that was the other blessed of Mr. Fool. That Death Consul? Indeed, he's an undying creature who lived since the Fourth Epoch. Old man's old friend. Yes, it might be other blessed I'm not aware of, but their levels definitely aren't too low. Other blessed. Does that mean Klein is also considered Mr. Fool's blessed? It's no wonder Mr. Fool said that he comes here and participates in the gathering, but the experiences are different from mine. It's because he's a blessed and enjoys the benediction of Mr. Fool, so he also has the ancient aura. It's why old man doesn't realize that Dwayne Dantes is played by different people. This explains my previous question. As a blessed, German Sparrow doesn't need to keep his identity a secret. But to Judgment Zio, Dwayne Dantes being a public identity, or him being German Sparrow was not her concern. The reason why she overreacted was because, after realizing the truth, she felt embarrassed at all her various thoughts back then. Seeing the atmosphere return to normal, Klein heaved a sigh of relief inwardly and controlled the world German Sparrow to answer Miss Justice's question. Yes. When the time comes, there might be certain matters that need all of your help. When he finished the second half of his sentence, the world swept his gaze across Justice, the Magician, Judgment, the Star, and the Moon. He has plans for something in Backland? Audrey instantly understood what Mr. World was getting at. She momentarily felt excited but also a little worried. She was excited because she was about to participate in a secret operation that all the participants didn't seem to have any ties with, to the point of not even knowing each other. This was something she had always looked forward to. Her worry stemmed from whether the operation would have any threat to Backland's safety, or if it would bring harm to the innocent. As for danger to herself, she wasn't too worried. She believed that Mr. World would arrange for the mission to be held in the outskirts of the city, provide key information, or cause serious misdirection to the target, without needing any direct participation or fighting. Emlyn was the second person to read between the lines. And this was a result of his innate aversion towards troublesome matters. Will it be troublesome, he thought with a frown without saying a word. While the other members came to a realization, Alja took a deep look at the world German Sparrow and said, I recently received news that the traitor of the Church of Evernight, Archbishop Zangwell, was killed in West Balam. Before that, he had already become a demigod. As for the sealed artifact, 0-08, which he had stolen, it's unknown whose hands it's in. The only thing that can be certain is that the battlefield was cleared by the Church of Evernight. The Hanged Man is very updated on the news. It's only been a few days. The church should have kept this strictly confidential. However, there might have been other factions arriving at the square that day. Leonard was taken aback for a moment, but he didn't provide more information. This was the first time Audrey and company were learning about the news. They could only determine that the matter was rather important from the words Archbishop 0-08 and demigod. But since it had nothing to do with them and there wasn't any stimulus, they weren't too intrigued. As for Catlia, as she had a deep impression and understanding of Grade O sealed artifacts, she planned on seeking out information on this via Queen Mystic and the Moses ascetic order after she returned to the real world. Amidst a brief silence, the fool Klein suddenly extended his hand and rapped the table's surface. He felt that he needed to warn all the members. In the coming years, the waves of the times would come flooding in. Upon hearing that, all the members straightened their backs or made them even straighter before turning to the seat of honor at the long bronze table. Even the newly joined Leonard and Zio were no exception. It was almost instinctive. Then, they heard the profound and lofty figure chuckle amidst the grey fog. The times have changed as a result. Rare latest chapters on no/v/e/l/b-in.com. The times have changed because of this. Int Zangwill's matter is key to something? Although it involves a Grade O sealed artifact. Alger, who had shared the news, never expected Mr. Fool to place so much emphasis on it. He was momentarily unsure what to make out of it. Leonard, who had participated in the matter regarding Int Zangwill, felt the same. He knew how important and terrifying the Grade O sealed artifact was, but he never expected that what happened that day would change the times. While Audrey and company wore blank looks, they focused fully. Even Derek couldn't help but take on an attentive posture. The fool Klein surveyed the area and said with a laugh and sigh, Adam is one step closer to being divine.